Good morning, everyone. I am Sherry Smith, president of the Bay Area League of Women Voters. We welcome more than 200 registrants to this most unusual Bay Area League Day 2021. We've got a wonderfully full agenda today, and so I'll be very brief. This is the beginning week of Women's History Month, and what better way to participate in that than with this presentation that we're calling Equity in Action. The purpose of today's event is to provide our local leagues with some tools you can use for your own commitment to the league's support of the principles of diversity, equity, and inclusion. One other thing I would like to mention before we get underway is that the Bay Area League is in the process of planning the transition of our Bay Area Monitor publication to a fully digital news publication. This transition will happen in June. And if you haven't yet, we invite you to sign up to subscribe to Monitor Notes at bayareamonitor.org. And now for today's presentation. A link to all of the PowerPoint slides that you'll see today will be sent to all registrants. And the presentation is being recorded, so that will be available as well. So you'll be able to share that also with other league members who were not able to attend today. And now here are some slides to show you a roadmap of today's event. Are you ready to do that, Madeline? Thank you. Next slide. Some housekeeping instructions are before you. You will be muted, you attenders. Please use chat to share your comments and questions. Our Q&A is disabled. And again, I remind you the recording will be posted on our Facebook page as well as being sent to all the registrants. On the right-hand side of the screen, you see our superstars, the Bay Area League Board. Next slide. Here's the agenda for today's presentation. First, we're going to have an inspiring address from Fred Blackwell, who's the CEO of the San Francisco Foundation. Then at 10 o'clock, there will be a panel on equity implementation, providing tools, measurements, and suggestions for campaigns. Then at 10:45, the economic impact of systemic racism will be explored by a three-person panel. And then at 11:30, the question of legislating equity, can it be done? And that will feature the Honorable Kalra, who is a member of the State Assembly and the author of the Racial Justice Act. And then finally, we will be concluded and wrapped up by Stephanie Doute, the Executive Director of the League of Women Voters of California. All right. Next slide, or let me just move now to our Bay Area League Board member, Roma Dawson, has coordinated this entire event with the assistance of several people on the board. So she'll be hosting us through the presentations. Thank you, Roma. It's all yours.
And thank you, Sherry, for your leadership on our board. And I'm hoping everybody can see the slide presentation. Are we on the slide?
Hold on 1 minute.
Okay, we'll give Madeline just a minute.
You have 60 seconds.
And we thank you all so much for joining us today, and please be patient with us.
Okay, and here we go.
to slide 4. All right, here we are. Here's a very well-known picture of suffragists protesting outside of the White House.
Whoops. That's the next one.
Oh, sorry, next slide. I'm sure these pictures here will look very familiar to you. And now on to the very well-known picture of suffragists protesting outside of the White House. And now I want to tell you about a woman that was part of the fight for suffrage from the early days of the movement, working with Susan B. Anthony and others. Her name was Mary Church Terrell. And here she is right now. Here's a picture of her. Mary was born in 1863 in Tennessee. Both parents were former slaves. She was an educator, writer, lecturer, and lived an amazing life. Born during the Civil War, she lived to be 90. She died a few months after the Supreme Court announced its decision in Brown v. Board of Education. She was a national activist for both racial equity and women's suffrage, which was somewhat rare in those days. Next, please. Mary helped found the National Association of Colored Women with others better known to us like Ida B. Wells and Harriet Tubman. She signed the charter that formed the NAACP in 1909. Mary continued to fight for racial justice for the rest of her life. Indeed, in 1950, at age 86, she filed a lawsuit when she was refused service at a restaurant in Washington, D.C. The result was a landmark civil rights decision, eliminating segregation in eating establishments. Next slide, please. I'm sorry, go back to the previous slide. Thank you. Oh, okay, we're ready for the next one. Sorry about that. Here we are to Mary's statement. And we're calling your attention to this statement. She made it in 1897. She said, "We proclaim to the world that women of our race have become partners in the great firm of progress and reform." At this time, she was serving as president of the National Association of Colored Women that she had founded just the year before. During a 1904 meeting of the National Women's Suffrage Movement, Mary pleaded with the white women present to stand up not only for the oppressed sex, but also the oppressed race. Next slide, please. Mary was actually teaching Latin at the first Black public high school in the country in Washington, D.C. when Alice Paul summoned women to D.C. to march in a parade planned for the day before President Wilson's inauguration in 1913. Black women who sought to participate in the parade were told to do so in a separate Black delegation at the rear. The national suffrage movement reflected the racial divisions that dominated at the time. This is a very long way from the partnership Mary talked about and yearned for in 1897. Mary did not give up on the suffrage movement and worked to pass the 19th Amendment, especially in her home state of Tennessee. And we all know how important Tennessee was to passage of the 19th Amendment. Next slide, please. And of course, we are facing some very hard truths. On the issue of race, the League's record was shameful. The National American Suffrage Association, formed in 1890, and Alice Paul's National Women's Party never challenged the denial of voting rights to Black men or racial segregation in the South. They took their racism into the League. Southern state chapters had white women only rules. In fact, the League's membership was overwhelmingly white, privileged, college educated, and married. And there again is a link to the article at the bottom of the slide. And just a reminder, you are going to get this PowerPoint if you're having trouble reading them. Next, please. All right. This is a joint statement that was issued by Chris Carson, then LWV US president, and LWV US CEO Virginia Case in 1918. I'll just read part of it. The League was founded in 1920 by American suffragist Carrie Chapman Catt. Catt was a complicated character and by modern standards, a racist. While fighting for the 19th Amendment, and she was lobbying Southern senators at the time, and then this statement was made several times, Catt said, "White supremacy will be strengthened, not weakened, by women's suffrage." These remarks are brushed aside as a sign of the times or a political strategy, but actions speak louder than words. Our organization was not welcoming to women of color throughout most of our existence, and you see that statement highlighted on the slide. Next slide, please. And here we are with our current board president of League of Women Voters of the United States. We must never forget our history and the tireless work of Black women and allies to advance voting rights, push for change, and continue to shape a more equitable America. Next slide. And we just want to point you to the many resources that are on LWV US website. I'm sure many of you have seen this graphic already. And again, the lwv.org website. Next slide, please. Hi, here is a little bit more League history we wanted to share with you and make sure you know about this book. It is The Untold Story of Women of Color in the League of Women Voters by Carolyn Jefferson Jenkins. She explores how the contributions of women of color to the suffrage movement were ignored or relegated to footnotes. This book provides an accurate account beginning with the suffrage movement all the way through to our last year's 100th anniversary. And we also note Carolyn was the first Black president of the League, and she served as our president from 1998 to 2000. And next slide, please. We promised to share with you some definitions of equity, and I'm not going to take time to read them all. Do note that the graphic on the right illustrates our goal, and that's to move to liberation and to inclusion. And note they're all wearing purple uniforms. Next slide, please. And again, here are some more illustrations that show the move to liberation. And I do ask you to note the slide on the illustration on the bottom that illustrates that access is, of course, an important part of equity. Next slide, please. And I'm not going to read these definitions. They're from the World Health Organization and UNICEF. Again, there are lots of definitions of equity out there. We just wanted to share some with you. Next slide, please. And here's a statement made by the Commission on the Status of Women, United Nations. Equity is a means, equality is the result. Next slide, please. And we quickly wanted to highlight that our new president signed an executive order on advancing racial equity and support for underserved communities on his first day in office. And there is a follow-up that's supposed to be coming. We're supposed to hear a report, I think, in about 6 months. Next slide, please. And of course, we are going to end this part of the program with a quote from Maya Angelou, the one and only Maya Angelou. "We are not our brother's keeper. We are our brother, and we are our sister. We must look past complexion and see community." Next slide, please. All right, the part we're all looking forward to. It is now my very great honor to introduce Mr. Fred Blackwell. Fred is a nationally recognized visionary leader known for his work to ensure shared prosperity, innovation, and equity in the Bay Area. It was natural for him to focus his career on addressing race, income, and poverty. He's from a legendary Oakland family, long involved in nonprofit and social justice organizations and in the civil rights movement. Fred leads the San Francisco Foundation, one of the largest community foundations in the country. And I'm not going to talk much more about him because he doesn't want that. He joined the foundation as CEO in 2014, where he works tirelessly to advance social justice through an agenda focused on racial and economic inclusion. Some of his many accomplishments, they're too numerous to mention, are on the slide that will be on your screen while he speaks. Fred, we're all looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Roma, and thank you to the League for inviting me. It's really a pleasure to be with you all this morning, and really exciting to see the League dig into these issues of race and equity at the level that you are. I had a chance to take a look at the agenda, and you all have some great panels coming up today, so I don't want to stand too long between you and the work that you are engaged in, but I just want to share a little bit about our work in this area and really share with you some of the things that we've learned in the work. And Roma, I really appreciated the presentation that kind of laid out the history of the League. It was some stuff that I really learned about, and I think one of the things that I really appreciate about the presentation is actually the real true acknowledgement of the League's history, and that, you know, so many of our institutions have similar histories. And I think that in many instances, you know, we think that we cannot simultaneously show love and respect for our institutions and acknowledge some of the problematic aspects of the past when it comes to race. As Roma said, I'm the CEO of the San Francisco Foundation, been there since about 2014. And in 2015, we embarked on a kind of new North Star for the foundation that's focused in on achieving a greater degree of racial equity and economic inclusion in the region. And while we are named the San Francisco Foundation, we actually have a regional footprint in the Bay Area. So in the East Bay, we serve Alameda and Contra Costa counties, and then along the coast, we're in Marin, San Francisco, and San Mateo counties. And when we adopted that North Star, it really impacted everything that we do. It impacts our grant making, it impacts our relationship with donors at the San Francisco Foundation, it influences our hiring decisions, it influences our personnel policies and procedures and the way that we operate every day. We like to kind of talk about our internal operations as one that really tries to reflect and be responsive to the external facing work that we do, and that we can walk the talk. And you know, one of the chief things that we have, I think, learned across this journey is that it's one thing to be conceptually kind of committed to equity and the concepts that are there. And it's a whole nother thing to be committed to equity at an operational level and thinking about how it impacts decision making and all those things that kind of influence us on a day-to-day basis. And I think for the Bay Area, it's a particularly important thing to move beyond the conceptual to the operational, because we have become so good at using the right phrases and the right wording around all these things that have to do with equity. I often talk about the fact when I'm with groups that equity has become the new coconut water, where you hear everyone talking about it, but you rarely actually see anybody really drinking it. And so I just wanted to share with you really briefly 4 things that we found as really important ingredients towards operationalizing a commitment to equity. One is, and Roman, you did an excellent example of this. The first is really acknowledgement. acknowledgement that we have a problem, and for the Bay Area, acknowledging that we have a problem here in the Bay Area. I think there's a tendency for us to think that the problems around race are somewhere else, that they're in Louisville, or that they're in Charlottesville, or that they're in Minneapolis. But what's really, for me, important for us to recognize in the Bay Area, particularly as someone who's grown up here, is how confusing our perception of the Bay Area is when it comes to all the things around being kind of progressive and liberal and inclusive, and how when you're a person of color, or if you're low income in the Bay Area, you really don't see those perceptions as reality. And so I think it's a very important thing for us, particularly in the Bay, to acknowledge that we have a problem here around race. You don't have to go very far. You can look at education data, you can look at health data, you can look at economic data, and you can see in all of those instances the very stark disparities when it comes to race. But it's not just acknowledging that we have a contemporary and geographic problem with race. We also have to acknowledge that we are in a place where we have to acknowledge our history as it relates to race in this country. I think an example was a good one this morning, but acknowledging the fact that many of the successes of this country, a lot of the history of this country is embedded in a very fundamental and early part of our history, that it was about the pursuit of free labor, which resulted in slavery and bondage, the pursuit of free land, which resulted in the genocide of Native folks. That is a part of our history, and we don't acknowledge enough here in the Bay Area or in the country in general, the underpinnings of this country and the implications of all that for the future. So the first piece to really operationalizing a commitment to equity is acknowledging the problem, acknowledging the harm done, and acknowledging our history. The second thing that I think is really important in terms of operationalizing a commitment to equity is that we have to get comfortable with the discomfort that is associated with the conversation and discussion and the discourse around race in this country. All of us who have been in serious conversations in this regard know that we are talking about an emotional topic. People make mistakes, people end up emotional, people get angry. All those feelings come up, people get embarrassed. And for me, I'm not the kind of person that actually runs to those kinds of conversations, and I'm sure many of you are not either. But the problem is that because these conversations are so uncomfortable, because they're so tough, we run from it. We avoid the conversations. And when we do that, it means that we lack the fluency to be able to engage in the conversations that are so critical to getting to a higher level of awareness and a higher level of understanding, and therefore a common path on where we need to go and how we need to get there. And so the second piece I think is really, really important. We've got to get comfortable with the discomfort associated with these conversations, and the messiness of it, the emotion of it is part of the work. That's actually the work. And so it's actually in those places where we are most uncomfortable, where we are making most progress when it comes to racial equity. The third thing that I think is really important is that we have to practice transformative solidarity. And what I mean by that is we've got to get away from the paradigm that enforces scarcity and the notion that one community's gain has to be another community's setback. And in actuality, we've got to get to a place where we understand that when we are meeting the needs of the most oppressed, the most disenfranchised, the most marginalized, we actually all benefit. And that the opposite is true as well, is that we all pay the price when we aren't meeting the needs and advancing the aspirations and the hopes of folks who have been left out. the best way that I can think about and kind of characterizing this and bringing it home for folks is something that my mom talks about a lot, which is the curb cut effect. And we've all seen curb cuts. Those are the, when we're walking down the street, you can see the curb where it comes down to the ground, and you can easily get from the street to the sidewalk. Curb cuts came about because of the advocacy for people who had mobile disabilities, and so that they could access the streets and sidewalks like everyone else. But when you sit and you look at and you see who's using curb cuts, you can see a lawyer with his briefcase full of briefs using the curb cuts. You can see the catering company that's running to their job using the curb cuts. You can see the young mother using the curb cuts to get the baby stroller from the street up to the sidewalk. Curb cuts are the perfect example of how when you meet the needs of the folks who are most vulnerable, those who are most in need of help, those who are the most marginalized, that there actually are benefits to everyone. And you can use that concept to advance other areas. I often talk about the fact that you use that curb cut theory and you apply it to law enforcement, you can see that the police department that is meeting the needs of the most vulnerable, the police department that makes a commitment to saying that Black Lives Matter is the department that I guarantee you is treating everyone with dignity and respect. Same can be said for education and health. So that concept, this concept that we have to engage in transformative solidarity, another community's gain is not another community's setback, and that when we meet the needs of the most marginalized, we all benefit is a very important concept. Last one. Too much of where we think we need to go and the vision for what we need to be as a country is based on some nostalgic view of the country and of society that never really existed. The most egregious version of that could be Make America Great Again, but I can name other examples as well. If the definition of equity is just and fair inclusion in a society where everyone can participate, prosper, and thrive, that means that we are in search of a destination that none of us have been to before, and that the answers are on the horizon and not in the rearview mirror. That means that we have to engage in another level of imagination. I would say radical imagination, which is the fourth point. Engage and embrace in radical imagination around where we can go and how we need to get there. Reimagining our system of safety, our concepts of safety, reimagining our education system, reimagining our health systems, reimagining our economy in ways that are radical. And when I say radical, I'm not necessarily talking about political radical, but I'm thinking about imagination that really unleashes us from the kind of limitations that we think about when we are trying to think about how we change or reform our existing systems in the margin. And so these four things, the acknowledgement that we have a problem, the commitment to getting comfortable with the discomfort associated with the conversations about race, the practice of engaging in transformative solidarity and embracing radical imagination are four steps that I think are critically important towards getting us from a conceptual and operational commitment to, and get us to an operational commitment to the work. And I'm convinced that embracing these four things, and there are others as well, will get us to the place where we want to be in terms of realizing that destination that none of us have been to before. So Roma, I see you popped up. That probably means I'm out of time. I really appreciate, again, being with you all this morning and really wish you the best for your day today.
Thank you, Fred, and thank you for those words. You've given us much to think about, and we do truly appreciate your time because we know that you are sought after as a speaker. So thank you again, and we look forward to having you at another league event. You're a regular, and we love that. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Madeline, if we can, I believe we are right on time now, and I'm very sorry that there are people that can't seem to get into the meeting. We did upgrade to webinar to avoid this problem. So I'm getting lots of emails and messages. Again, this is being recorded. So we will make sure everybody that signed up for the event gets the copy and make sure they know they can listen on YouTube. And now, again, so many thanks to Fred. It was just great to hear from him. Now on to our first panel, which delves into equity implementation. And you can see it on your screen. We're very fortunate to have Carolyn Wysinger as our moderator for this panel. Carolyn's an education coordinator for the Commonwealth Club of San Francisco. She's an educator, workshop leader, and media personality. I could talk much longer, but I'll stop there and hope you read about her on screen here. Carolyn hosts the C-Dub Show, a very popular podcast. And in her spare time, she also serves as president of San Francisco Pride. And again, Carolyn, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Roma, and thank you so much to the League of Women Voters for having me today. You know, this is a great and amazing day, and I'm sure that I'm not the only one that was invited to a million different Women's Days event, but I'm happy to be here to share this day with you all and to have this amazing conversation about equity and implementation. You know, we of course just came out of an important campaign season, and so many of our campaign events, our voter drives, our town halls, all had these conversations about equity. And I remember being in at least one where the moderator literally asked what was equity and what did it mean to implement it in the position that you were going to be running for. So I'm happy to have these great panelists to talk a little bit more about what it looks like to actually implement equity in your organization or in your government agency. First, we do have Darlene Flynn. Darlene is the director of the Oakland Department of Race and Equity. Darlene has been the director since 2016. She came with over a decade of experience as one of the original architects of the now nationally recognized model of the Seattle Race and Social Justice Initiative. In Oakland, she is working to implement the equity mission of the city to intentionally integrate on a citywide basis the principle of fair and just in all the city does to achieve equitable opportunities for all people and communities. We also have with us today Zulma Maciel, the director of San Jose Office of Racial Equity. Zulma Maciel is the director of San Jose's newly created Office of Racial Equity, where she aims to institutionalize equity and support sustainable transformational change so that ultimately Black and Brown communities experience better outcomes. Her diverse leadership experiences, track record of authentic community partnerships, result-driven approach, and commitment to racial justice has enabled Zulma to live out her calling in this new role. She has served the public for over 2 decades in various capacities, such as policy development, administration, and management of a $15 million grant portfolio. In 2015, she became the first director of San Jose's Office of Immigrant Affairs, committed to creating an environment of belonging and service to immigrants and refugees. Collaboratively with community partners, Zulma developed the city's first Welcoming San Jose plan that outlined an ambitious set of goals and strategies in service and immigrants and refugees. So I want to welcome both of our panelists. Do we have them up here, Roma and Madeline? There they are. Hi, Zulma. How are you today?
Good morning. Fantastic and happy to be here.
Good. And I think I see there's Darlene. There's Darlene coming. Grace. So great to have both of you. And I think that reading both of your resumes, it's important to note that when we're talking about equity, you know, we saw immigration in Zulma's profile. In my particular profile at San Francisco Pride, we deal a lot with equity in the LGBTQ community. So every community is all about bringing that equity piece. I want to start with Zulma. I know that you wanted to give us some words about what it is to implement equity in your organization.
Sure, great. Thank you. And thank you to the League of Women Voters for inviting me. I am super thrilled and delighted to be spending a Saturday morning with so many wonderful sisters across the Bay. I also want to thank the League for acknowledging at the beginning the historical inequities that have been perpetuated by the League. That is an important step, like Mr. Blackwell mentioned earlier, towards this journey, right? Towards a journey towards racial justice. So in San Jose, for my colleagues and I, it's been a time to reflect on the role that government institutions have had in creating and perpetuating policies that have harmed Black and Brown people as well. And so the recognition of culpability has opened the doors to long overdue conversations about race, about the systems and the structures that have benefited some while further marginalizing others, and about the responsibility that we have today to correct where we have caused harm. So through the Office of Racial Equity, we aim to advance those systems change that ultimately improve outcomes for Black and Brown communities. And of course, we can't do this on our own. We recognize that it requires ground truthing by the community, meaning the truth finding, the truth telling, so that we arrive to a space of reconciliation and restoration. So allow me to step back briefly. I'm not sure if I'm going to go right into how we actually operationalize this. I am? Okay, I see the nodding. Okay, good.
Yes.
So I'm going to take a step back briefly to explain how we've even arrived to this point. So the city began to explore racial equity work in 2017, primarily internal dialogues that were had, participating in the Government Alliance on Race and Equity, which is a curriculum and a program offered out of Race Forward. But it wasn't until 2019 that it really evolved. And that's because we had 5 San Jose City Council members, all Latino, who were advocating for resources to be distributed equitably, with an emphasis on communities that had been marginalized, either through redlining, historical, pieces, harmful policies, or inadequate resources. And so in 2019, those public conversations really accelerated the city's journey. And soon after, we, the administration, hosted 2 council study sessions to describe why leading with race and equity work is important, and what racial equity is, ensure that we have the terminology and the understanding of these concepts. And then the second study session, we focused on how we actually put this into practice. So we're still newbies at all of this. I mean, we have a lot to learn, and what I've understood, that advancing racial equity is both this journey, this process, as well as this outcome that we're trying to achieve. And so again, the acceleration of these conversations happened not only because of 5 city council members that really, were pressing and wanting to center equity in policy work, but also 2020 happened. And the pandemic, the awakening to the reality that Black men and boys were experiencing violence in the hands of law enforcement, the elections, so much happened in 2020 that it almost was this perfect storm, right? And not a storm in a negative way, but really this, where the nexus of opportunity and timing came at such that the Office of Racial Equity was established. It was unanimously voted and supported by the mayor and 10 council members. And that happened in June of 2020. So 2020 was a big year. I was appointed in October of 2020. And so I've been at this for about 4 months. And in this short period, I really have been encouraged by the initial steps that we've taken to advance this work, like adopting a racial equity framework for the city organization, which I'll get into in just a minute, building a San Jose Equity Atlas, essentially a data portal for city staff to use to inform their work. I'm encouraged by the leadership that's actively engaged in these difficult conversations and these dialogues about race and equity. We have a very enthusiastic workforce, and we have several work groups that have formed throughout the city working on data, workforce, community engagement, and reimagining community safety. And there's so much more that's in motion. So I'd like to share a slide about what the very first slide I have really sets the framework. And so because I had been doing a little bit of this work through the Office of Immigrant Affairs, which the Immigrant Affairs work is now being folded into the Office of Racial Equity. and the team. And so thankfully I had a team to start with, a small and mighty team, 3 of us. But it was important to note, oh, and it looks like a few pieces are missing from the slide, but that's okay. So initially, when we started in October, we had to think about, so where are we in this place? And we knew that we didn't have the luxury to spend time on normalizing conversations about race. But one of the things that we did adopt from the Government Alliance on Race and Equity is this framework around normalize, organize, and operationalize. And then under the normalized category, you have some runway to work with for example, in the city of San Jose with the organization, to do some trainings, to do some applied practice programs about how you actually embed racial equity in all that we do. But we didn't really have the luxury to just sort of start there. So we had to organize, which is the second bullet on this slide, which is build the Office of Racial Equity team and a citywide infrastructure. And what's important about this is that while the Office of Racial Equity not only was funded with a director, it also has a manager and a senior executive analyst that will be part of this office. So the hiring is slow, like in most large local governments, but we're getting there. So building the team is important. That's part of organizing, as well as the citywide infrastructure, which means that the work of advancing racial equity doesn't fall on the shoulders of the Office of Racial Equity, but that it's shared responsibility. It's everyone in the city organization of over 6,000 employees must share in this work. And creating that citywide infrastructure will take time, but there's already a lot of movement in organizing and preparing the organization to do this well. The items on 3, 4, 5, and 6, I'll just go briefly. We realized that we didn't have a whole lot of room for training. Everything has to happen simultaneously. All of these things, these 6 goals are happening concurrently. But embedding equity in the budget process, we either could have waited another year until we felt like we were ready to embark on embedding a racial equity tool in the budget process and putting this on the responsibility of all departments. We could have waited a year to do some training and then roll out the tool. We decided to just go for it. And the reason is that part of this practice means that you just have to do it. And it's not going to be perfect and it's going to be messy, but it's progress. So we moved. In December, we decided to meet with all directors, and we said we have a budgeting for equity worksheet that we'd like you to try on for size. And really what it is warm-up exercises for all departments and how to center equity, answer a set of questions that will allow them to think about their budget proposal packages in terms of who will be burdened and who will benefit as a result of these proposals. And so this is not only a work that will help with exercising that equity muscle for people in the organization, but it also will inform the Office of Racial Equity about where the gaps are, what we need to do to build the capacity of the organization to do this better. And then the other areas around supporting reimagining community safety, community and economic recovery efforts during the pandemic and post-pandemic will be an important role for the Office of Racial Equity, as well as incorporating the important work to support the immigrant and refugee communities in the city of San Jose. And so just to give you an example, I know I'm running out of time, on the second slide that I have, when we think about applying the racial equity principles, these are the 4 principal areas that we keep asking department directors and city staff to consider. And it's not just what we realize is that these are actually very good things to focus on, these racial equity principles, not just for budgets, but for policies, for programs, for all that we do. And while this is a simplified way of looking at things, obviously when you take a deeper dive on all of these, you realize that you actually have to put this into practice and begin to experience and learn some of this. So it's not as easy as just let's apply a racial equity lens on something. You have to have people who have an equity mindset, who are asking good questions, who are peeling back the layers of the onion and who are willing to do the work, root cause analysis, effective community engagement, to actually get to a place that informs good public policy. And as public administrators, that's our role. That's what we should be doing. So the first piece here is we want to focus on impact. What ultimately do we want to do? What are the outcomes that we are aiming for? Number two, look at the data. What does the data tell us? And is the data disaggregated by race? One of the areas where we've been challenged is finding good, relevant data disaggregated by race. If you just have data in aggregate form, it doesn't really help you identify the root causes and really be able to see the disparities in the communities. So leveraging data is number two. The third one is very important. And I would say this is even more important because the centering community voice is what gives you insight. So data is a snapshot of numbers in time. The community voice and effective and meaningful community engagement is the ground truthing. And that's the piece that really helps inform budgets, policies, programs, and practices. And then the fourth piece, which is, we're not there yet in the city of San Jose. We're fairly new at this, but it's establishing accountability. So once we identify, we've gone through the work of, we know what we want, focus on impact, we leverage city data, we center community voice, we have to create the mechanisms to tell us and eventually have a public dashboard that tells the general public how we're doing and making things better for Black and Brown communities. So that's just some of the work that we've embarked on since October. We have much more to do. And I lean on people like Darlene from Oakland and other chief equity officers from other large cities who have been doing this work, who have the experience. We're not, we borrow things. So looking forward to hearing from Darlene next. And with that, I will hand it over.
Thank you so much. You made so many important points, and I'm glad that you ended your segment by saying you lean on Darlene, because that means I don't have to introduce Darlene. So Darlene, could you tell us a little bit about how you implement an equity lens in your work there and in implementation in Oakland?
Sure, I can try to do that. I'm not going to turn my camera on. I'm out of town on a shaky cell phone connection to you all. So I want to stay with you. And you could just put the slide up, my slide, and then people will know who's talking to them. That might be good. And it won't look so strange that my screen is blank. So I wanted to, it's such a pleasure to follow both Fred and Zulma, because I've worked with both of them a little bit on the work that they're doing. I've had a chance to talk to them and be with them a little bit as they think about their journey. So it's really great to be here with them today and with you today and following them. What I want to do is drill down a little bit on how this idea of organizing, one of those three pillars that Gare stood up, the normalizing, organizing, and normalizing the work into your environment. This is really important, not just at the institutional level. This is actually how systems change. And so I want to talk to you the way that I talk to folks in the city of Oakland. Our department is also very small. There are 3 of us, and we are working across an organization of about 5,000 employees and more than 20 lines of business. So we have to organize if we hope to move the needle on racial injustice. We certainly, the 3 of us, cannot do it, and neither can any of you in any configuration other than something that looks like critical mass for change in this country. And that has happened many times before, but here are the kinds of things that we want to make sure that we are focusing on as we go forward. First of all, we have to understand that this is a system problem, that racial inequity at the group level is pervasive in every measure of life in US society. And it has resulted from interpersonal, institutional, and structural systems that have enslaved, that have committed genocide, that have forced labor and then expelled the bodies that they extracted the labor from. forced assimilation and then denial of full access to resources of society to countless people of color over the history of this country and right now. People of color are disproportionately represented in the poverty class in this country. Our life energy is still being extracted and leveraged for extraordinary wealth at this point of time at the top of the country. So this has only changed incrementally over time, but it has changed. And those incremental changes that have happened permit us to have this deeper conversation now. My life has been much different than my father's life was. He was born in 1914 in southern Missouri. He spent his life stepping out of the way of white people on sidewalks and doing everything that he could to survive the era of Jim Crow and lynching in the South. So I did not have that experience. I had a different experience because of the work that was done in the civil rights movement. And the work in the civil rights movement was organizing work. It had to be organizing work because even though there were brilliant leaders, and many of us can list some of those leaders, they were very important to the movement. It was the other people joining in with them and creating momentum for that tipping point of change that required leadership to make changes in that overt, intentional racism that my father endured. So there are some things that we think about in doing this. First of all, we know that this is a strategic response. Although many of our hearts break at racial hardship, we can't stop at just having a broken heart and feeling sad about it. We have to say, we're going to do something about it and begin to develop the strategies to get there. And that's what happened in this work that Gare is doing. The work that Gare also came out of Seattle and the model that I helped create there. And this was us as a city at that time, thinking about how can we strategically dismantle the systems that are, or dismantle, not the systems, but dismantle the racism in the systems that are causing racial inequities. So it was very intentional. And we drew on all kinds of expertise, including social change observer Malcolm Gladwell, who articulated the tipping point of change and how we can all fit into it. But then there's a lot of research behind that, and we looked at that too. So we thought about, how does change happen? And we know that it happens through presenting a compelling case for change and getting that compelling case for change into enough hearts and minds that people are truly dissatisfied with the way things are in this country or with the way things are in your organization or your city. So to Fred's point about we have to be lovingly critical, that's very important, because if we're not critical about what's not working well for everyone in this country, then we will not be mobilizing ourselves or others to bring about that change. We must look at the things that are not right yet and look at the next layer of the onion. I love all these metaphors that I get to use all the time, came in this morning through Zulma and Fred. We have to recognize that this is our time. We are peeling our layer of the onion. Others who came before us set the stage. They made it possible for people like me and Zulma to even be working in these organizations. Or Fred, we wouldn't have been in these positions in my father's time. He was a pin setter and a chauffeur. And I mean, he had the service jobs that Black people got to have. Pin setters, by the way, work in bowling alleys. He went on to become a professional bowler, not at the television level, but to compete in tournaments because of that beginning for him. And as things opened up, he got to walk into opportunities and bowl on lanes that when he was a young man trying to make his way, he would not have been able to be on those lanes. He would have been behind the scenes setting the pins in the machinery down at the end of the alley. So this is how I know things have changed. But I also know that when we look at the data that Zulma talked about, that at the population level, we should be very dissatisfied with our social outcomes in this country. And we should recognize that because of the history of this country and how it's impacting people now, we could choose to take responsibility for doing something about it. So it's that ownership of becoming strategic and becoming part of the change and part of the movement. And the good news is that even when those civil rights changes happened, there was not majority of people in this country who were in favor of them. There were just enough who were dissatisfied enough and working very hard, and sometimes even risking their lives at that time in order to bring the change to the forefront and make the change happen. And many analysts say that the thing that tipped the level of dissatisfaction in this country around the civil rights changes was when the movement began to be televised on the evening news. and when the whole country could see police and law enforcement sicking dogs and firefighters turning fire hoses on children who were protesting for their basic civil rights. And when people saw that, more people rose up, more people joined the movement across the nation and said, this is not who we want to be. It may be who we are, but this is not who we want to be, and we want to change it. So that idea of having a clear idea that we are going to change it, that we are going to craft strategies to get there. We haven't crafted all of them yet, but we're going to keep building them until we get there. It's an ongoing journey. We're peeling the onion. We're getting to the bottom of it. We're getting to the core. So then we have to work to activate others. And that's what I'm doing this morning. I want you to activate not only as the League of Women Voters, but as individuals within the League, that your life is going to be dedicated, your organization is going to be dedicated to this kind of organizing action that can build critical mass for change. And that may be a changing role for the League of Women Voters, but I've had experience with the organization as a former elected official and as a former member at that time of the League of Women Voters in Seattle. I know the potential that the League holds. And just the fact that you're having this conversation today shows me that you are getting ready, if you're not already ready, to raise the bar for the League of Women Voters and for everyone in your environment. You're not limited. We all have spheres of influence. We can be organizing anywhere we are. And yes, it can be uncomfortable to bring up these issues. It can be uncomfortable to broach these topics in our circles, wherever they might be, or maybe even within the League of Women Voters, because we have to grow that. We have to grow that muscle to be able to stay in the room, keep our attention on difficult topics like race when we want to be impactful in the world. And that is motivating for me, even when it's really uncomfortable and even when I'm tired, and because I've been doing it for a long time now. And even when I feel like I'm up against people who are just never going to get on board, if you will. I just have to remind myself how this works. There have always been people who are not on board. That is normal. That is typical. Social change happens anyway, if we go about it strategically. So as we activate people, we're going to have to help them get educated because they've been miseducated about race. They don't understand how systemic it is oftentimes. They have bought the dominant narrative that we live in a meritocracy. And if people's lives aren't going well, that's because they didn't pull hard enough on those bootstraps that, by the way, were never issued to them in this country because only certain people got bootstraps. Yes, lots of people have pulled themselves up over time, and they were given land, and they were given federally subsidized mortgages, and they were given freedom of movement, and they were given all sorts of advantages and opportunities to pull themselves up. Reparations for Black, Indigenous, and people of color will be actually giving people those bootstraps. People ask me all the time, what would reparations look like? And I say, reparations is simply giving to poor Black, Brown, Indigenous people the same opportunities that you gave to poor white people in the history of this country, that enabled poor white immigrants and poor white people in general to pull themselves up through enormous government subsidy and support over time, to the point that now these communities of people who are white by definition are self-sustaining. I mean, they now can pass it on, literally pass it on to future generations. We want to make that so for Black, Indigenous, people of color in this country, because if we do, they too will prosper. And so if we can see that that's what we're about, and that sometimes it's political, and sometimes it's social, and sometimes it's relationship building, and sometimes it's coalitions, and sometimes it's groups of people that we're close to who will mobilize with us that don't even have an official name. Once we see that we are part of that, and that's what I loved about Malcolm's book about the tipping point, was that he talked about how different people with different personalities and different skills and different, I don't know, attitudes, if you will, or personalities is the best thing I can think of, all have a role in building momentum for social change. We don't all necessarily play the same role, but we can all pick up a piece of it. It's quite inspiring. And we can do our part together with others. We are a whole. And so as we move forward, we can begin to do the kinds of things Zulma was telling you about that her city is doing, and that is set goals and specific things that you want to change, like the budget, specific things in the world that you want to change, like voter suppression or gerrymandering or some of the political things that interfere with voting for Black, Brown, and Indigenous people. And I know from your slideshow that you all are thinking about these things already. So I just encourage you, you are moving in the right direction. Keep going, get bigger, join with leagues across the country, get stronger, get more powerful, but also look in other directions, because it won't always, maybe you won't feel that you can do your best work or your highest purpose in that location. So you can spread out and you can take the skills that you're learning here in this webinar and also with your work with the League of Women Voters, you can take that on the road and you can have influence in other places. So don't be constrained. It's a big world. There's a lot of opportunity to make change. And we know that when we build a strong foundation of knowledge, understanding of racism, how it was built, how it's maintained, when we prepare others, when we share that information with other people so that we begin to build that critical mass, which, by the way, social scientists have determined is only about 30% of the population in any given environment. But they can't just be nodding their head. They have to be actively working for the change. They have to be actively putting in energy into doing things differently or challenging systems that are functioning in a way that increases or maintains racial disparities. But when you get 30% in a realm actively working on that, that is the tipping point of change. That is when the momentum becomes almost unstoppable, because at that point it becomes so contagious. And this is oftentimes we use, sadly, I'm not using it as much right now, a public health model of epidemic and how epidemics spread. Once epidemics get to a certain point, and we have had quite an object lesson in this, once at first it seems like nothing's going on, but as things begin to exponentially spread and we hit a tipping point of change, suddenly it's everywhere. And that is what happens with social change. If you ask people about the civil rights movement who were around then, most of them now would even perceive themselves as being part of it, even if they weren't, because their attitudes eventually changed and came into alignment. Many people, not all, but many people joined in, at least psychologically, and supported at the ballot box and so on. So I think that just understanding that there is a way forward, and it is through organizing and building this momentum for change, and how well positioned the League of Women Voters is as an organization, and you are as individuals within the organization, because the fact that you are a member of the League of Women Voters indicates a certain level of commitment already to the kind of changes in social discourse and changes in social ways of being that are needed. You're already up to bat. So now what you're doing is you're perfecting your swing and you're getting other people to join the team so that there are so many others with you. It also won't feel as heavy and it won't feel as uncomfortable, because you will be surrounded by a community of resistance that will be speaking the same language and who will reinforce the changes that you're trying to bring. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Darlene and Madeline. I don't know if what the league intends on doing with this video, but Darlene and Zulma dropped so many gems. I mean, we really need to take this recording and chop it up and send this out into the world, because I'm really inspired by all the things that you said about bringing race and equity into organizations. And for myself, and I'm not going to say too much because I do want to get to our questions and answers. But, you know, in my experience, I'm working more of a nonprofit environment. San Francisco Pride is an organization that is seen to the world as if all it does is spring up a parade in June. It just springs up out of the ground. That's what happens. But I think that in becoming the president, one thing that was important to me was reminding the organization, because we are so large, everything that we do does affect public policy. And so how were we able to bring more of an equity lens to the things that we do? How are we able to change the way that we look at this budget that we're criticized so much about? So now we're looking at ways that we can become more funders. First, tell our story about how much we do actually give out into the community, how much a good chunk of the money that we bring in from our sponsors do go to supporting our LGBT organizations. But because we are so good at bringing in money, how can we increase that capacity? So increasing that equity piece by increasing how much money we're giving to our trans community, our homeless community, our youth communities, but also looking at another thing that we've been highly criticized, which is our role in relationship with police. We understand that safety, especially at an organization this large, is important, but we do also have the ability to create these conversations organizations to make sure that our community is feeling safe in a way that folks who don't have this platform are not able to do. So I would encourage anyone that's here in our attendees, just because you're not working in Oakland or working in San Jose, whatever organization you are in, locate that area in your organization where you can bring an equity lens, because I promise you that is very needed in that organization to make some sort of change in our community. And I want to shout out Susan, who is one of our attendees. She randomly recommended that people watch the webinar called the Commonwealth Club Educating for American Democracy. Thank you, Susan. That was my program. I helped produce that. Yes, please, everyone go find it on YouTube. There were a lot of amazing information that was given around equity in teaching our students American democracy and how we can make our classrooms more equitable. So some of the questions that we wanted to give to our panelists, which are very, very important for our league voters. First, I'll ask Zulma, how do we better address equity in city government decision-making? What are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things. And, one of the things that the slide that I shared was really the application of a racial equity lens on budgets, policies, programs, and practices. But one of the most important things that organizations can do is begin to change the culture. And culture change doesn't happen overnight. But I heard recently somebody say culture will eat policy for lunch. And I couldn't agree more. So I'll give you an example. You could have, for example, we created in the Office of Immigrant Affairs a language access policy, meaning that we expected every department to make sure that any engagements they had with residents of San Jose, which is a population of 1 million people, nearly 40% of the residents in San Jose are foreign born, and over 52% of households speak a language other than English. If we weren't centering and creating a policy, a language access policy that truly met the needs of our community, then we really were not thinking about being an inclusive San Jose, a place where we wanted to make people feel like they belonged, and really just to understand how to access city government. So while the intent of creating that language access policy is good, it's the practice that's most important. And how do you practice it? Well, you have to have a culture that actually really cares, right, about accessibility issues, whether it be language or otherwise. And so we began to we trained over 1,000 public facing employees on the language access policy, not just about, by the way, there's an language access policy in the city of San Jose. But number two is, how do you operationalize this? And how do you, as a person, make other people feel when you interact with them? And so really that actually, those conversations that we have with city employees about a language access policy and changing our mindset about how we actually deliver a service and seek to have a good customer experience, not just a good service, a good experience, means that we're going to see others, human to human level, that we're going to be respectful of the language that they speak. We're going to be respectful of the way that they want to receive information. But those conversations actually was when we began to just scratch the surface on biases, implicit bias, explicit bias. And then that kind of led us on this work of racial equity. And so again, how you can apply this racial equity principles that I spoke of earlier, but you have the culture has to change, because if the people in the organization aren't asking key questions along the way, or engaging community in a respectful and meaningful way that works best for community and meet them where they're at, then it's just a lens that you put over things, right? It's the way that you practice it. And so I think ultimately it's culture change, which is most important. And I haven't figured that out, but we're working at that.
All right, and I'm going to move through this fast because we only have a couple of minutes, so I'm going to try and get through as many of these questions as I can. Darlene, can you tell us what is our role as a community member to ensure that we have equity in decision making?
Equity in decision making in your government?
Yes.
Demand it. Demand it. especially if you have high levels of privilege. You know how you exercise that privilege to make sure that your children navigated the school system well, or to make sure that you got good service when you were paying a high price for a meal. Bring that kind of energy to it. And so demand it, and demand it persistently until you get it. Do not stop demanding it. One of the challenges that movements outside of government have is that they wax and wane. And they're not sustained sometimes in between the conversations. Maybe it's the presidential election, or maybe it's the killing of George Floyd, whatever it is that is riling people up in the moment. People's commitment to seeing that through to the end, through to change, can be weak. And so don't be weak. Be strong, be persistent, stay with it, and don't take no for an answer. You're going to get some no's. This is very important to organizing work. You're going to get some no's along the way. Don't you know it? Yeah. And so just be ready for those no's, and be ready to knock on another door. Keep knocking, keep asking, keep demanding, and center the systems. We don't need another program. We don't need another Band-Aid. We need the systems to get the boot off of the neck of Black, Indigenous, and people of color in this country. So if we can have a broad multicultural movement, we can get that to happen, because we harness the political power that can make it happen.
All right, and let's see the next question. How do we measure success in implementation? That's a good one. What equity standards are we promoting? Zulma, would you like to take that one? How do we measure success in implementation?
I actually think that Darlene is probably better equipped to answer that question, since we haven't really created the mechanisms for accountability. But I will say that part of our training program will include the results-based accountability model, so that anybody, all public administrators have an idea of how to do this effectively, but also be able to hold ourselves accountable, but also make it very transparent to the public. And that's what I meant about putting a dashboard online that will show progress made on particular indicators that we and the community agree that we want to change, right? That are the most important indicators to change. So we're not at that stage yet, but we have a vision for how to get there. Darlene?
Okay, Darlene, you want to tag on to that?
Sure. I think that we have to, first of all, government just has to own up with, we're not accountable currently, and we don't measure our outcomes at all, hardly. We measure our intentions. We have good intentions, right? And then we say that. We have good intentions, and we do a lot of inputs. So we measure our inputs, we measure our activity level, but we don't measure our outcomes. So this is a big pivot for government. And it is the reason that result-based accountability was invented. It's actually a way of thinking about this that is system-focused, and that teaches people, shows people how to measure outcomes versus inputs and activity alone. It's okay to measure those things, but that's not enough. We need to know whether or not we're making a difference in people's lives. And eventually we'll know that we're successful by seeing the disparities decrease in our life outcomes for Black, Indigenous, and people of color. But until we get there, we want to make sure that our programs are contributing to that. So we want to have measurements that show that we are making a difference in people's lives, and that is sustainable, and that it is that the system will be sustained to continue to support that. So we need to start setting benchmarks about that. It's not that hard to do, but it's very foreign to government. Again, we get measured, and we have historically been measured on how much we do, not whether or not what we're doing is equitable, or whether or not it is actually making a difference in people's lives that is a good difference, which is why so many unintentionally, sometimes bad things come out of a government policy, because we don't set these kinds of benchmarks for ourselves. We don't check, and we don't course correct very well. So this is a huge learning area. The city of Oakland's still struggling with it too. I expect we'll be struggling with it for a while, because it is kind of counterculture. Talk about culture. It is completely counterculture to track those kinds of outcomes.
Okay, and last question. I think that this is one that I'm particularly interested in as a nonprofit leader who's trying to get better at implementing an equity lens in the organization. And I'll leave this to either one of you who wants to answer it. Are tools used by government entities different from those that might be used from nonprofits? Hard one. neither one of them has an answer.
No, I do. I was waiting because I talk too much. No, I think the theory of change that we've been talking about, that both of us are using, can work anywhere. And it will look a little bit different in a nonprofit organization because your structure is different. So your stakeholders are different. So the way you plug people in will be different. But the theory of change is based on system change and organizing for system change theory that has been used in many different environments for actually many years. We're just bringing it in-house into government. So I think we borrowed so much of it from the community that I have to say it absolutely can work out in the community.
Yeah, if I can add, I think Darlene is 100% right on that. I think community-based organizations have already used the theory of change in many instances and have logic models for some of their programs, and have adopted, elements of the RBA model, results-based accountability. And what's interesting is that when I was managing a large grant portfolio, we required our nonprofit partners, our grantees, to follow, to create a logic model for all of their programs. Yet the city of San Jose wasn't doing the same thing, right? It was just almost too much work for us. But I think if we can all get to a place where we agree on the indicators that are most important, that, what are the outcomes that we ultimately want to see change, and what are the indicators that are going to tell us whether or not Black, Brown, Indigenous, people of color are better off as a result of our either policies or programs, then there will be some alignment between what foundations and the nonprofit world and government will be putting their energy behind. And so I look forward to a day that we can get there. But I think we're starting to find each other in these paths, and I'm optimistic.
Well, I want to thank Darlene and Zulma so much for joining us today. Like I said, I have gotten great inspiration from both of you, and I hope that so many of our attendees have as well. Thank you all, and have a great day. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Carolyn, and thank you, panelists, for some very practical advice. And thanks to those of you that are entering great information into chat. And I did enter the link. Darlene and Zulma both referenced GARE, Government Alliance on Racial Equity. And I did enter that link in there so you can do a little more research if you want. So again, thank you. Our next panel concerns the economic impact of systemic racism, and will be moderated by Kiku Johnson. Kiku has 30 years of experience with youth development and responsive community program design through a social justice lens. Kiku is now the executive director of the Rainbow Center of Contra Costa County. And now, Kiku, we would like to invite you to moderate this panel. Kiku, you're muted.
Thank you. That was the way I wanted to start too. This is the life of Zoom. So thank you for reminding me, and welcome everybody to this next panel focusing on the economic impact of racism. And thank you to the panelists and Carolyn moderating right before. So many important points that I've already excited to underscore in some of the pieces that I'm going to be sharing, and with the two other incredible humans that are going to be joining on this panel. So I want to share and introduce Paulina Gonzalez-Brito. Paulina is the executive director of the California Reinvestment Coalition. She has worked for more than 20 years leading economic justice organizing campaigns to expand worker rights, immigrant rights, and the rights of low-income and underrepresented communities of color. She is called upon frequently to speak as an expert in the fields of Wall Street accountability, discrimination in lending, and equitable reinvestment by financial institutions. We also have with us our second panelist, Sarah Treuhaft, and she is the Vice President of Research for PolicyLink. Sarah Treuhaft supports its policy priorities, oversees research across the organization, and expands its research partnerships. She oversees its National Equity Atlas and launched the Bay Area Equity Atlas the All in Cities initiative, and the Jobs for All campaign. Sarah has led numerous partnerships with advocates, academics, and organizations to use data to advance policies to achieve racial and economic equity. I'm very esteemed to be sitting on a panel with these two incredible folks. And so I would love to invite right now Paulina to join us and share some words and some guidance here on this topic.
Thanks so much, Kiku. I'm glad to be here with all of you. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's really excited to join you this morning as you delve into this really important topic. And so my name is Paulina Gonzalez-Brito, and I just want to tell you a little bit about, so we're a statewide organization. We have 300 organizational members across the state of California. And what we do is we work to dismantle white supremacy within the financial system. And we do that to close the racial wealth gap that has been built up over generations. And so as you can see, I'll start with the first slide. Sorry, is my video on? I'm not sure you can see me, but hopefully you can. So what I want to do today is talk to you about that very thing, how talking about anti-Blackness very specifically and white supremacy within the financial system, and not being afraid to use those words, right? We can talk about racial equity, and we need to do that, but actually using these words very specifically and talking about what they mean and how we actually begin to dismantle them in a very specific system. Darlene was talking about system problems, and we're going to be going directly into the financial system and how that relates to economic impacts. So next slide, please. So I want to start with asking you to think a little bit about your own story and your own path to building wealth or building income over time, and maybe even over generations. And so I'm going to start by telling you about my own story. And so on the left, you'll see a picture. This is my dad and my grandfather and my tia Alicia, and they're in Michoacan. So I come from the Purepecha people and the Chichimeca people of Michoacan and Zacatecas. But this picture actually shows the land that we now own in Michoacan, and that land came to us by what I would call actually reparations from the Mexican Revolution. And that was won through kind of like a land back movement to the people of Michoacan. And so, and my grandfather, who you see there, actually went and with his father to demand that land to Morelia, the capital of Michoacan. On the right, you'll see many of you have probably seen these redlining maps, and I'll show you a bigger map in a second, with the red, yellow, and green that showed levels of risk. And these were government maps. And so my grandfather on my mother's side, this is Montebello. For those of you who are from Los Angeles or familiar with Los Angeles, it's in Southeast Los Angeles. He was able to buy a home in Montebello only after my aunts and uncles were old enough to work so they could help pay for it and help pay for the down payment. And we bought that house, or my grandfather bought that house in the yellow zone there. And if you can see in the legend there, it says possible threat of Mexican infiltration. So that was an area where banks didn't want to land, and we were the Mexicans they were worried about. Next slide, please. So let's talk a little bit about what anti-Blackness means. Many people think about it as a person on the personal level, right? They think about it as racism, between one person and another person, and thinking about racism against Black people. And it certainly is that, but it actually is much more than that. It's a system-wide problem, and it has to do with system and structural racism, and it devoids Black people of value. And what it is actually is a system of anti-Black policies, practices, and ideology. And we were talking today about culture, right? An ideology that actually predetermines the socioeconomic status of Black people, first and foremost, but actually BIPOC people, Black, Indigenous people of color, kind of with a layer of colorism, so it predetermines socioeconomic status of Black people. And so that is anti-Blackness. And I think it's really important to define that as we think about white supremacy and anti-Blackness and systems. Next slide, please. So this is a map that many of you are probably familiar with. These are the HUD maps. They were made by the government. You saw a snippet of Montebello earlier. And so what I want to say about this map, and for us to never forget, is that the redlining that happened by banks. So they said, the red is, too risky for us to lend because that's where Black people live. Yellow, is probably less risky, but still risky. That's where Mexicans live or foreigners live. That was fully backed because banks were not lending, starting in the 1920s, fully backed by the US government. And as white people were building wealth over generations by buying homes backed by the US government, backed by banks, the rest of us, Black people, Mexicans, Asian Americans who were living in the US, over decades at this time, were not building that intergenerational wealth or had a much harder time buying homes and building that wealth over time. So that's that HUD map I wanted you to take a look at. And so next slide, please. So what does that look like today? Like, why do we think about yes, it stopped us from building intergenerational wealth over decades, over generations, but does it still impact us today? So this is Oakland. I live in Oakland now. I'm from Los Angeles, but if you look at a snapshot of a redlining map and what it looks like today, and so this is Oakland, a redlining map. You see the red, yellow, and green. What you see is harm upon harm upon harm, because what you see now is these green dots. And what we did with our partners at the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project, is we began to map where banks are lending to what we call serial evictors. So these are landlords who are buying up properties and they're then evicting the lower income people who live there, who tend to be people of color. And because we know where the red, yellow, and green, and then renting them out to higher income people, displacement and gentrification, right? So we then see this, what we call serial forced displacement, and we see the harm happening again in the very same neighborhoods where they were happening, generations ago or decades ago. And so we often think about discrimination and racism happening generations ago and having impacts generations later. But what we don't often learn about is that that happens again and again and again in the same places to the same people through these financial systems over time. So next slide, please. So again, thinking back to, we teach what racism looked like in the past. We've learned, many of us, if maybe some of us actually learned about this in history books. Some of us don't learn about this in history books, or we learn about them in different ways. We think about these signs that were up in restaurants, in banks, and different institutions and school segregation. This is a sign that was up in Texas. And this is what we learned about what racism looked like in the past. But next slide, please. We don't often think about what it looks like now, or we don't learn about what it looks like now. So the Paycheck Protection Program, which was passed as part of the CARES Act, was run through banks primarily. And it took a long time for advocates to get some sliver of that money to be run through community development financial institutions so that we can get it out to most of the small businesses that were being left out, which were Black owned and Latino owned, Asian owned, immigrant owned. So what that meant was that, banks have excluded lending to our communities for a long time, we know that. And so what that meant was that 2% of the loans, the PPP loans that were meant to help small businesses during COVID, went to Black owned small businesses. 2%, 6% went to Latino-owned small businesses. And when we looked at the data last year, 40%, we lost 40% of Black-owned small businesses last year in COVID during the pandemic, compared to 17% of white-owned small businesses. Next slide, please. So remember in the beginning, I talked about what anti-Blackness is, right? Predetermines, there's these 3 pillars: predetermined socioeconomic status, policies, practices, ideology. I want to talk about the first 2 for a minute, policies and practices. When we think about ideology, we should really take a moment to really honor the movement for Black Lives Matter, that has begun to really shift the ideology and the narrative and the immense work that this movement has done to really lift up the idea that actually Black Lives Matter, that Black work matters, and that, you know, and so I just wanted to take a moment to really lift that up. But I'm going to focus on the first two, policies and practices, for a moment. Next slide, please. So I just want to say, you know, policy change is essential. So when we're thinking about policies, practices, how do we really do the work around these two areas and really begin to push? Darlene said, you know, we must demand it. And this is where we, you know, really must demand the change around systems and structural change. And we must center systems. Next slide, please. So when we think about practices, right, we talked about policies and practices. After George Floyd was murdered by the police, we really began to see the movement begin to push the Black Lives Matter. People were taking a knee, and we saw Jamie Dimon from JP Morgan Chase take a knee. And this is his, you know, a Twitter picture of there's Jamie Dimon, and he's taking a knee and he's saying Black Lives Matter. And I want to say, first of all, that it's important that Jamie Dimon take a knee. You know, it's important that we have somebody like him, that we have these people in high positions of power take a knee and say that Black Lives Matter. That's an important shift. But on the right, Jamie Dimon and Chase are members of the California Bankers Association. Credit unions are members of the California Credit Union League, and they're opposing policies that begin to shift the reality of the predetermination of the socioeconomic status of Black people, Brown people, Indigenous people, people of color across the country. So on the one hand, you're saying Black Lives Matter. On the other hand, you're actually doing things that are counter to the idea that Black Lives Matter, that Black work matters, that people of color deserve, you know, a living wage, or that they deserve housing. So that's, you know, something that we need to reckon with and demand that change in practices. And that's where policy begins to come in, and we have to overcome that. Next slide, please. So a couple of, I wanted to bring to your attention a couple of policies that we at CRC are beginning to move forward that begin to challenge and begin to really try to move the needle. AB 1199 is authored by Assemblymember Gibson from Los Angeles. So after the foreclosure crisis, we began to see Wall Street gobble up homes, gobble up multifamily buildings. We talk about the serial evictors, Blackstone colony homes. Many of these now own our communities, and they own hundreds, if not thousands, of properties. And so what we're talking about with AB 1199 is, and actually they've begun to create LLCs, so we don't even know who owns that house across the street, that apartment building, and people who live there don't know. So it creates habitability problems, and they can't go to their landlord and ask them to fix an issue. So what we're proposing with AB 1199 is transparency around the LLCs, one, so who owns it, and there has to be a database with the Secretary of State in California, and two, an excise tax on large corporations that own and rent out 10 or more properties in California that can create a revenue that goes into affordable housing in California of over $1 billion annually. These corporations have to pay their fair share. Next slide, please. The second bill that we're moving forward is AB 1177 by Assemblymember Santiago. Assemblymember Ash Kalra, who I think you're speaking to later today, is also a primary co-author. When we think about who's not banked in our state, this is who's not banked: Latinos, Black households, disabled Californians, and actually 1 in 4 Californians. And what that means is they're going to the payday lenders. They don't have access to building their credit, right? This is who's unbanked. So what AB 1177 does, next slide, please, is it actually banks Californians and through a state entity, a state depository. And so it's beginning to build a system to bank those who the big banks refuse to bank. Next slide, please. And finally, I'll just say that money influences. Socially responsible investors, philanthropy, pension funds hold relationships. We are pushing banks to do racial equity audits so that they begin to look at their own practices and what policies they are actually opposing at the state level or supporting. Are they supporting affordable housing or not? Are they opposing affordable housing? Are they supporting or opposing policies that would actually benefit BIPOC communities? And I think that's the last slide. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Paulina. Thank you, Paulina, for that presentation and sharing. There's a lot of rich pieces. I'm excited that we're going to be connecting. I'd love to invite next Sarah Treuhaft, the Vice President of Research and PolicyLink, to share her presentation.
Thank you. Is my video working? Oh, okay. I can't see myself. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. Am I supposed to pull up my own presentation, or is somebody forwarding slides? Just one. Oh, there it is. All right, thank you. So I am, Kiku already shared my bio, but I'm Vice President of Research at PolicyLink, and I oversee research across the organization. And I've also been overseeing our equitable economy portfolio over the past 10 years. And we just we're bringing on a managing director to oversee that work. But a lot of my work has been around economic equity, and that is rooted in our research partnership, the National Equity Atlas Research Partnership with the University of Southern California Equity Research Institute. So what I wanted to talk to you about today is that work, the grounding of that work. So it's really a mix between how we do research at PolicyLink and democratizing data and equipping people like yourselves, advocates, engaged community members, grassroots organizations with data to help them advance campaigns for racial equity and shared prosperity. And we also have a very specific Bay Area Equity Atlas. It's our only regional data tool like that as well. So I definitely want to leave you with kind of a link to the Bay Area Equity Atlas so you can check out this sort of data for the region. So I'm not going to use all of the slides I gave you, but I will use some of them. So if you can go to the next slide. So our National Equity Atlas Research Partnership began about 10 years ago. And really it was to fill this void in the field because research institutions like the think tanks that you see research being produced by, they were not disaggregating data by race and ethnicity to any extent. It was very, very uncommon. Every time a report would come out, we would see it at PolicyLink. It was, we're an organization, our mission is advancing racial and economic equity. We would see the research and we're like, why aren't you disaggregating the data? Like when you share that percentage for the whole population, it's inaccurate because it is not the same for Black people, for Latinx people, for women, disaggregating by the multiple identities people hold. So we saw this void. We also saw the need for a stronger narrative around equity as both a moral imperative, it's unfinished business from the civil rights movement and before then, it must happen. We must have greater opportunity and reparations, et cetera. But also it is a national imperative and an economic imperative. We cannot have a strong economy. We cannot have strong communities when we have such gaping racial disparities and inequities, especially as we're undergoing tremendous demographic change across the country, where people of color are the majority in many places already and are becoming the majority nationwide. You know, by 2045 now it is, right? People of color will be the majority and sooner for the workforce, and already now for youth ages, I believe it's 20 and under now. It changes every year, but you know, so this is a huge shift we're going through as a country, and we need to be proactive in terms of ensuring everyone is able to thrive. Everyone is able to provide for their family. So the National Equity Atlas Partnership was kind of born from those ideas of shifting the narrative on equity and providing data that is deeply disaggregated so we can understand how are we doing on equity and sort of track and measure our progress toward equity. Next slide, please. So we do three broad things. One is around shifting the narrative and providing research at a high level to elevate equity issues, and things like rent debt and how it is inequitable by race. Like people of color are suffering more in the pandemic and have greater rent debt and are more likely to be renters because of all the issues Paulina was bringing up, right? And so bringing those issues to the fore. We also partner with communities to produce locally tailored analyses, and I would say tools like the Bay Area Equity Atlas is a partnership with, you had Fred Blackwell speaking earlier today, the San Francisco Foundation is our partner on the Bay Area Equity Atlas. And so we provide that tool to equip Bay Area advocates, and then democratizing the data and making it broadly accessible. Next slide, please. We think our approach to research is very unique. We really strive to always be co-creating our research and our data products with advocates that are working on the ground for change. So for example, in the Bay Area, we've been working with the Contra Costa County Budget Justice Coalition, and we've been supporting them in making the case for equity in the budget in Contra Costa County in various ways. And one thing that we did, we recently gave, they recently gave a presentation at the Board of Supervisors meeting and invited us to share some indicators of equitable recovery in the Bay Area. And one thing that we found when looking at a survey of water debt in the region, that the California Water Board had done this survey, and we analyzed the data in the Bay Area, and we actually found water debt, you know, households that are owing on their water bills, it is higher in Contra Costa County than anywhere else in the region. And so we presented that data, and then that led to the Housing and Human Services Department allocating resources for clearing water debt. So that sort of partnership in co-creating data products and analyses and responding to the needs of what advocates need on the ground is like deeply embedded in what we do. But then we also produce these tools that are broadly available to people like you that we haven't met or talked to. Next slide, please. Another big part of how we do data and research is around how do we share a liberating, people-centered narrative about equity and how critical racial equity is for everyone, that everyone is going to benefit from equity. And Fred talked to you about the curb cut effect and how this is something that he's borrowing from his mother, right? Angela Glover Blackwell was the founder of PolicyLink, and I've worked really closely with her, and she worked really closely on starting up this National Equity Atlas partnership and helping us to develop this narrative, which we called it initially, equity is the superior growth model, not meaning growth as in, just like bickering, but growth as in how we're growing as a community and as a nation. And so, so our narrative undergirding the National Equity Atlas kind of starts with who we are as a nation and how demographic changes are occurring. And next slide, please. And so we start out with, racism. We have an index of a racial equity index that kind of measures comprehensively how communities are doing on racial equity across 9 different indicators, looking at economic participation, connectedness, things like housing burden, and transportation access and air pollution. So we create this holistic measure that so we can compare cities, how they're doing on racial equity, and then you can dig into any one place to understand how you're doing on various indicators or areas of change, policy areas. So, but the first part of the message really is that, racism is our most urgent challenge. This is everywhere, no place is doing well when it comes to racial equity and inclusion. Every place needs to do better because of the systemic challenges we face in structural racism. Next slide. And then the second part is around demographic change, the communities of color are growing and driving population change and growth almost everywhere. And if we do not address it, it is urgent that we address exclusion, oppression, and racism so that everyone can reach their potential and have what they need to participate and thrive. Next slide. And the third part is about how that will strengthen our communities and our economy, that equity is our key to prosperity, really. Like if we address these issues, we're all going to benefit. In the Bay Area, and you can see this on the Bay Area Equity Atlas, if we did not have racial inequities in income, so that's one indicator, just in income, right? We would have $350 billion more in economic output every year. So that's, more spending for local businesses, more business opportunities for people, more resources to go into our local tax base to support schools, et cetera. So this is the kind of messaging that's throughout our data products. Next slide. I'm actually gonna halt here and go away from the slides. So I just wanted to mention, two things before I close and I'm done with my time. But so that is the undergirding messaging framework behind all of our data products. And you'll find this on the Bay Area Equity Atlas. I will, after I'm done speaking, I'll type some resources into the chat. The Bay Area Equity Atlas is just bayareaequityatlas.org, but you can find this sort of data, this messaging, also solutions. So we believe that data needs to be accompanied by solutions and strategies and examples and also stories. So you'll also find on the Bay Area Equity Atlas, examples of lived experience, like stories of residents that are experiencing issues that are being highlighted by the data, like rent burden and rent debt and lack of, challenges, but also how people are participating in the solutions and the change and advocating for those solutions. I will stop there because I know that we want to have time for questions, and I will add those resources in the comments, but hope that you can go onto the Bay Area Equity Atlas and find useful data, useful messaging, and strategies that you can push for in your communities and in the region. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for your voice and sharing. And I know there's a rich mix of things. And I'm going to share a little bit about where I fall in my position. And before we head into maybe a couple questions, so I'm going to be thoughtful about our time here. And one of the things, again, my name is Kiku Johnson, Executive Director of an incredible local Bay Area nonprofit that serves our lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, questioning, and intersex plus folks, LGBTQI. And that's Rainbow Community Center of Contra, Costa County. And the focus of where we are as a nonprofit is promoting the well-being amongst our people and our allies. And so I'm really going to be sharing very quickly from a nonprofit lens around the impact of racism economically. And we know that this is a global issue. We know it's real. There's a very rich moral argument that we're having today around addressing this, and where do we start to do that and more effectively do that. And I want to share that one factor that's often ignored in this conversation is the broader economic dimension, because it prevents people from making the most of their economic potential. We know that systemic racism carries significant economic costs. And we are really trying to achieve a less racist society so that we can economically become a stronger one. So we know that that's the lens that we're really looking through and wanting to achieve. I know that just looking at the wealth gap between American white individuals and Black individuals is projected to cost our country between 1 trillion and 1.5 trillion in lost consumption and investment between 2019 and 2028. And this translates for us to a projected GDP, a gross domestic product penalty of 4 to 6% in 2018. A lot of this information I'm sharing with you is coming from the International Monetary Fund from an issue released last fall. And I wanted to kind of land here first, looking at where is the broader scope. And we can think about other countries as well, when, for example, France, where the GDP could jump to 1.5% over the next 20 years with an economic bonus of 3.6 billion. And this is done by reducing racial gaps in access to employment, work hours, and education. When we look at Brazil, for example, which is losing out on huge sums of potential consumption and investment because of its marginalized communities right now, we should be really looking at not trying to address racism simply because it will help economic development. It's a debt owed to us and our citizens. The world should understand that commitment to respecting human rights and racial equity shouldn't be a passive statement of our values. It should be a call to action and backed by active measures to acknowledge, understand, and measure and eradicate this racism in our systems. Our world is at a very important inflection point right now. You heard some of our speakers already address just the time that we're at in history. And I think that it's up to us, and namely our policymakers, to meet the moment. And all of us have the ability and the power together to assess and audit and inform and engage our systems differently. If not, racism will continue and cost all of us. One of the things I want to talk about with nonprofits, I'm a person of color. I'm someone who identifies as a transgender male. And that's something for folks when I'm coming to the table, I'm holding those intersections. And I know previously being someone in a female body, read in society as female, being a feminist, and continuing with that lens through the work that I do now, that shows up differently when I'm at the tables, asking for money. And we know that organizations led by folks like me, we win less grant money, and we're trusted less to make decisions about how to spend those funds than groups with white leaders. White-led groups and organizations have budgets that are 24% larger than those led by folks like myself. Organizations led by Black women receive less money than those led by Black men or white women. And amongst the groups focused on and organizations improving life outcomes of Black men, revenue at organizations with Black leaders is 45% lower than at organizations led by white individuals. To me, that's astounding and real. We know that these organizations win less grant money, we're trusted less about the decisions of how to spend that money. And for me, a really great example, it can boil down to, I've worked at several nonprofits over my 30-year career, and I've been asked to sit at a table and why I spent money for a meal while traveling, justifying mileage that I'm using to, and being a leader of an organization and being questioned by board treasurers and other leadership at an organization. I give you those examples because I think it's really important to understand that you can achieve leadership at an organization and still have to be contending with being questioned about your sound ability to make decisions, to organize, to lead, and in turn develop other leaders. We know that a lot of nonprofits that focus on these similar issues, the gaps are even larger when we're dealing with, again, we're talking about grant money that comes in. Organizations that focus on improving life income outcomes for Black men and revenue at organizations with Black leaders, again, 45% lower than white leaders. I keep wanting to repeat that because I feel like that's an astounding percentage right there. And this is now. And this is coming from a study through the Chronicle of Philanthropy just a year ago. And this is during the pandemic in this time. In some ways, this isn't surprising to me. Leaders of color in the nonprofit sector have been talking about this for decades, and this gap is deplorable. Even when nonprofit leaders of color win grants, differences remain. Unrestricted assets of nonprofits with leaders of color are 76% smaller than those led by white individuals. Among the groups focused on improving the lives of Black men, the unrestricted assets of groups with leaders of color are 91% smaller than those with white leaders. These are clear indicators that foundations don't trust us to spend money wisely. My own experiences that I mentioned earlier, they continue. This is not something of, during my development time from years ago, but this is something that I continue to manage ongoing. We know that unrestricted assets are a cushion. They're the breathing room that give our organizations the ability to pivot, to be entrepreneurial, to be able to be more sustainable. In that wiggle room and cushion that white-led organizations have, specifically Black-led organizations automatically don't have that. Some last pieces that I want to share with you here. I really appreciated, Paulina, you defining around geographic redlining for folks in our audience. And I want to talk a little bit about philanthropic redlining and how that shows up. We know that our Black leaders are well aware of these funding disparities, and our organizations are underfunded for that reason. They end up having smaller staffs, smaller budgets, and little to no operating reserves. There's a group that published its own study of organizations led by Black individuals in just this past December that found 60% of the groups surveyed had budgets of 500K or less, that just 23% had reserves of 3 months or more. And we know that in this time, to be able to stay above the water as a nonprofit, as an organization, reserves are really key. For example, my own organization, Walking In, we have no reserves. And so what was mentioned earlier, even with the Paycheck Protection Program, if we didn't get that loan for our organization, we wouldn't have survived. It's quite literally that in this time. So myself aligning with people, knowing that people can look me up online, they know my identity. I'm always thinking about that in terms of how I show up in spaces, how I'm proactive with talking with funders and going after and making relationships happen differently. At the end of the day, it comes down to not only institutional racism, but we're really looking at personal bias. These are things that are just extremely difficult for our sector of nonprofit to take on. Nonprofit leaders of color also report many barriers in the foundation funding, in addition to the statistics I just shared with you. We lack the social networks and often connect leaders with foundation staff. We struggle to build rapport with foundation staff, and because of these biases, we have trouble sustaining funding and relationships once they're formed. And we're lucky and fortunate. I'm representing the nonprofit sector specifically with LGBTQI individuals, and we have the Horizons Foundation that we know is a 40+ year organization that's based in the Bay Area. So I get to represent a nonprofit for a very marginalized community that when we have a foundation like Horizons based in this area, this is the San Francisco Bay Area. I originate from the Midwest. Again, I mentioned intersectionally, I am someone of color that if I were to have remained in some of the spaces that I were in, trying to find leadership opportunities. It's a difficult thing. These fundraising challenges are very difficult in this time, especially for nonprofits. And so with that, I could go on. There's definitely a lot of rich content that we could be sharing. And I want to be able to hear voices from our audience and some questions for our panelists, including myself. So for Paulina, myself, and Sarah, some of the things that have already been rising up here is a question around, are there other organizations that support the bills that support AB 1177 and AB 1199?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So on AB 1199, which is the corporate landlord transparency and excise tax, which is actually homes for families, that would be ACE is one of the supporters, and they're a great organization. And then Housing Rights Committee in San Francisco, they're two of the co-sponsors. There's many others who endorse. We have almost 150 endorsers, and the link I put on the chat, you can see all the endorsers. And then on 1177, the co-sponsors include the California Public Banking Alliance and SEIU California. And so, and then we're working on the endorsements. That bill was just entered in as a bill last Friday. So yeah, thank you for that question. And we're very excited about both.
Yes, thank you. Also, there's a question here, is there a comparable Southern California equity access data, as we have many active leagues there? And I think that's accorded to you, Sarah.
Yeah, so on the national, there is not a specific Southern California Equity Atlas. Honestly, the only reason we could do it is because we're in the Bay Area and we had a partner like the San Francisco Foundation, because it really requires, we have an Equity Campaign Leaders Advisory Committee of grassroots organizations that tell us what kind of data is needed, and we work with them to produce the analyses, right? And so it's not exactly replicable, although the University of Southern California is in Los Angeles, so maybe Southern California, but it's not exactly replicable. They have, however, two resources that you could find. There is a Southern California equity profile that was produced by our partners that you can find on the National Equity Atlas. And then also the National Equity Atlas does include 30 buckets of indicators and you can pull up information for Los Angeles and Southern California on the National Equity Atlas.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm very mindful of our time here. I know that we had a lot of rich information shared between the three of us. And I want to remind folks that are in the audience that there's many reading recommendations that are being shared with everyone. And that will be copied through the chat with everyone. And hoping that we had more time, definitely. And appreciate each one of you, Sarah and Paulina, for the very specific information that you shared, even for myself, helping further my education around where we are locally and connecting with the two of you in conversation. So I'm going to turn it back over to Roma, and thank you for this panel.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, panelists, for that great information. And again, we're so appreciative of your time. And now it is my privilege to introduce Assemblymember Kalra. Assemblymember Kalra has dedicated his life to public service. He made history in 2008 as the first Indian American elected to the San Jose City Council, my hometown, by the way, San Jose City Council. And then he made history yet again in 2016 when he was elected as the first Indian American to the California State Legislature for District 27, again, a first. He's championed legislation on healthcare, sustainability, housing affordability, transportation infrastructure, and expanding economic opportunity for all. Assemblyman Kalra chairs the Labor and Employment Committee. And then he serves, I know a lot of you are interested in this because you're following some bills, and he serves as a member on Housing and Community Development, Judiciary, Transportation, and Water, Parks, and Wildlife committees. And before we go to Osh, if Madeline, you could now put up the Racial Justice Act Coalition slide, please. And Madeline may not be there. I'm going to go ahead, and I think Osh is still Assembly member. Are you there?
Yeah, I got back on. My laptop froze up, and so I just jumped onto my cell phone. So I should be back on.
No
you hear me
problem. We have a
Okay.
lovely picture of you here. And now we're going to show a slide that we in League are very proud of. And this concerns the Racial Justice Act Coalition. Here's a lovely picture for you. The coalition consisted of ACLU, American Friends Service Committee, Asian Americans Advancing Justice California, California Coalition for Women Prisoners, Californians United for a Responsible Budget, Ella Baker Center for Human Rights, Next Gen California, United Domestic Workers, AFSCME Local 3930, and the League of Women Voters of California. And now the Assembly member is going to share his insights, some of his experiences that he gained while working on equity legislation, and especially we hope the Racial Justice Act. So Assembly member.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I just switched over to my cell phone. I put my phone on a selfie stick here so I can just hold it up like this. we had to improvise, you know. I always have it ready to go when my laptop gets overworked, as oftentimes happens. But it's so great to be here, and you know, I always love meeting with the League of Women Voters, and I really want to commend the League for the activism and the increased interest in issues of social justice, whether it's economic justice, environmental justice, and certainly you know, voter engagement and access, and in this case, criminal justice reform. And so for those that don't know, you know, I spent over 11 years, or I spent 11 years as a public defender, and that time really informed me as to so many injustices that occurred in our society, economic and otherwise, but obviously and particularly in our criminal justice system. And the data has shown it over many, many years, the disparities that exist in our justice system. And so what we were able to accomplish with the Racial Justice Act is we became the first state in the nation to allow us to use, and just as a foundation, it's already, as you can imagine, against the law. You're not allowed to in the court system use race and you know, be prejudiced, and you know, race is not and cannot be a factor in arresting someone and charging them and convicting them and sentencing them. Now, that being said, up until the Racial Justice Act, the manner in which it was applied was that it had to be explicit. So someone had to be very intentional and explicit in their racism. And we know that that's just not, you know, obviously that happens, but that's not how racism, especially systemic racism, impacts our society. And we've learned a lot about that over the past year, joining millions in the streets of the Black Lives Matter movement, seeing the voter suppression that occurs, and so on. So what the Racial Justice Act did is it allows those that are the accused through their attorneys to challenge an arrest, the conduct during a case, a conviction, and sentencing based on discrepancies on race. And what that really means is now they can look at data and statistics and say, you know what, in this particular county, a Black man is 4 times more likely to get arrested for a particular crime or sentenced to prison than a white man, all other things equal. What it allows then is a judge to be able to look at that and say, you know what, you're right. We're going to make the sentence equivalent. We're going to reduce the sentence to essentially root out the racist prejudice that is built in to how the sentencing is done. And it's not, and sometimes, you know, it's not necessarily that an individual judge or DA would have you, it's not like saying, okay, that person is racist. It's that our system has built-in biases in it that have over the years very clearly created racist outcomes. And this has been shown to be the case even here in California, and in some cases, especially here in California. And I'm gonna see if I can pull up some data on that. But what the Racist Justice Act did for the first time ever, it allowed us to really take into account those discrepancies, and allows us to really start to deal not just with racism on the surface, but racism in outcomes that occur. And so, for example, just one example is that in the criminal justice system in California, a black man is over 8 times more likely to be incarcerated than a white man, and controlling for conviction history and current offenses. Black men are convicted of a felony were 42% more likely to be sentenced to prison than a white man convicted of a felony. And for Latino men, it was 33%. And so, those are very real outcomes that are occurring in our system. And I apologize, my finger up there because I'm using my phone now, so trying to pull up some of the data. But what the Racial Justice Act did for the first time, it allows us to be able to actually challenge some of the outcomes. We know the disparate outcomes in death penalty cases, for example. And the ultimate result is not to not hold people accountable. It's to make sure that people are being treated the same. For example, one more example I'll give is just as a hypothetical, is that if you have a county and where, let's say, in auto burglaries, that 95% of those charged with gang enhancements are Latino men. And you can challenge the gang enhancement, say, wait a second, this is an auto burglary case and you're adding a gang enhancement. And we believe that the reason why you're adding a gang enhancement is because of my client's race. And this is the data we show to back that up. And so at the end of the day, a judge may agree and strike the gang enhancement, but the person's still going to be held accountable for the auto burglary, be potentially convicted and sentenced for that. So it's not about letting people off the hook, for example. It's about holding people accountable. The last thing I'll mention is it also speaks to racially coded language. So if a DA or a judge uses language, for example, only Black men are called thugs in certain types of crimes, in certain types of cases. And that's been shown to be racially coded language, or metaphors and analogies to animals, which has actually been shown to be used in some cases by prosecutors. And obviously it's racially coded language that we want to root that out. At the end of the day, we want to just root out the systemic racism in our system and create behavior change amongst our police officers, our defense attorneys, our prosecutors, our judges, so that there's acknowledgement of these implicit biases and that our system treats everyone equally and the outcomes are fair for all.
Thanks, council member. I mean, I'm sorry. I apologize. I demoted you there. I was tripping down memory lane. Sorry about that. I mean, Assembly Member Kalra. And now I believe that we're going to be able to take some questions. And just to clarify, if you will please enter them into chat. And before we'll give people time to queue up on some questions. Could you talk a little bit about looking forward into the current legislative session that's going on? We had a panelist earlier mention a piece of legislation involving financing. Paulina from Cal Reinvestment. Could you comment on that, please?
Well, before I do that, I'll be remiss if I didn't mention the fact that the League of Women Voters, the California League of Women Voters, was a co-sponsor of the Racial Justice Act and was instrumental, given the credibility the League of Women Voters has, was so instrumental in getting it passed in the first year. We didn't necessarily expect what happened, but it did happen. And now, once again, the League of Women Voters is co-sponsoring the Racial Justice Act 2.0. Someone made mention of that. I think Gloria did. And what that does, to get bills through, and I think that some of the policy folks in the League of Women Voters understands this, that as you go through, there's you have to go through appropriations. So they attach a cost to the bills. We had to cut off all the retroactivity of the bill. So the Racial Justice Act applies to cases January 1st of this year forward. So we have AB 256, which is the Racial Justice Act for all. League of Women Voters is a co-sponsor. That's to make the Racial Justice Act retroactive. We think now that we've acknowledged that we want to root out racism from our system, just because someone was convicted before the enactment of the act doesn't mean they shouldn't have the opportunity to challenge what they believe are racist outcomes in their conviction or their sentencing. So just want to put that out there. And I really appreciate League of Women Voters for once again supporting it. And I think that I believe in the finance. Is that a question regarding the public banks?
Yes.
Yeah. So I'm very happy to be joining once again with Miguel Santiago, David Chu, and others on the public banks. We were successful in getting legislation through before in terms of allowing jurisdictions to start their own public banks. And with Roma and I being here in San Jose, I would love to see San Jose push forward with that. I know LA and others are already looking into it. And the idea and concept, we have another bill this year to actually create a state public bank. And the idea behind it, and for those of you that are familiar with how finances operates, especially in the public sector, a lot of the financing that happens, and I'll give San Jose as an example since that's my home, but it applies to so many other cities, is that so if the city of San Jose is financing their bonds or refinancing bonds, we go to Bank of America, Morgan Stanley, all these Wall Street banks in order to get our financing done and to finance. And we're talking about hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars, even at the city level. So at the state level, you're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars. If you include all the cities, I mean, it could even be more than that. And so the idea is, why are we paying all these fees and interest to private sector banks when we can have our own public bank and reinvest the money that we get in fees and interest back into our community, back into our infrastructure, and have the opportunity to do things in a public bank that private banks aren't necessarily willing to do, like at some point do, you talk about predatory lending and all that. We might have an opportunity to give small business loans at really great interest rates, loan forgiveness, maybe eventually allow individual consumers to be able to get loans to hold them over rather than going to a predatory payday or a check casher. But ultimately, the most valuable aspect of it is public financing of our major projects, of our major funds. And why don't we gain the profit from it and reinvest any interest or anything we get out of that back into our community? It's the taxpayer that's paying for the bonds and paying for the funds. Why don't we benefit from that as well? And that's why I'm very excited about it and very enthusiastically in support of public banks. I very much support conversations at the federal level, allowing our postal service, our post offices to be public banks. Imagine that, having our postal services. There have been cases in the distant past where you did have like post offices kind of have banking there and all that, or banking offices, but to actually formally allow our post office to be a public bank and help that run the post office. So the issue of insolvency of the post office that comes up sometimes, because the postal service is an invaluable service. And so in any case, I'm fully in support of it. We're going to need your help to get that through. And I'm actually in the process of seeing if we can do some kind of convening in support of public banks here locally. So I would love to have the League of Women Voters supporting that as well.
Could you give us that bill number?
Yeah, it's in fact someone I think.
Or we'll put it out later to everyone.
Someone mentioned in the chat. It's AB 1177.
Oh, great! Thank you very
by
much.
Miguel Santiago.
All right, and also back to Racial Justice Act 2.0. I believe there may be a housing committee meeting soon. If some of us might like the opportunity to speak to the committee, is there a pending meeting?
Oh, for housing committee? I don't know
for
what our
housing.
next. I don't know what our next one is, but we can let you know. When
If you could let us know, yeah, we'll put that out because we got some questions about it. Folks wanted to know. And if we're ready, we do have a league member who used to be a public defender and said that there are many low-income minorities that do not realize that even admitting to a crime they didn't do could affect the rest of their lives. And do you support the idea of everyone receiving counsel when they reach the courtroom?
Oh, 100%. I mean, I guess I was a public defender for 11 years. And, although we do know the accused and criminal defense, when someone's arrested, they are read their rights. But, oftentimes we're talking about a power dynamic there. When you're a police officer and police officers are trained in how to get you to give up your rights and to speak to them, that's how they're trained. And so we want to make sure that everyone has the opportunity to be educated on what their rights are. But additionally, one of the things that I've been talking to the Public Defenders Association about is funding to allow for those that are not currently being charged with the crime to come to the Public Defender's Office for assistance. Let me give you an example. Let's say as a public defender, you have a client, and let's say they successfully completed probation, maybe they had drug cases and what have you, and now they want treatment, or maybe they have questions about something, but they're worried about incriminating themselves because as they're asking the questions, maybe they will be admitting to some kind of conduct. And, we want, at the end of the day, we want people to get treatment. We want people to get help, but where can they turn to? Usually when I've had clients in the past, the only opportunity they have once they're completed with probation to get help again is once they're arrested and back in the system again. There should be an opportunity for them to go to the public defender's office, even when they're not being charged with anything, and say, hey, I have an issue that came up. Just like someone that has the resources can call a private attorney on a retainer and ask them questions and not make themselves liable for a potential criminal conviction. So I'm supportive of money that would go to public defenders' offices that would allow public defenders to have attorneys that can speak to people that aren't currently being charged. That's a major issue as well. I was also supportive and have been of those being accused getting a public defender at arraignment in misdemeanors. What oftentimes happens is you'd be assigned a public defender, but before you're assigned, the judge and the DA would be like, well, if you plead guilty right now, we'll let you out of jail. And they don't understand the long-term implications of that without having advice from an attorney. And so that's why we want to make sure that people aren't pleading guilty to things without having advice of counsel first, because it has lifelong impacts when they do that.
Thank you. And I believe you've actually already answered this question. We have someone that commented that European countries offer financial services at the post office. And I believe you've already stated you're fully in support of that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Again, I want to remind everyone that you are welcome to place questions into chat right now if you have more for the assembly member. And I am wondering if you want to talk a little bit about healthcare legislation.
Sure. Yeah, I do have a little bill, AB
A little
1400.
bill, yes.
Yeah, and it's a single payer bill. And this is a bill or an issue that comes up on occasion. I think, and I believe truly to my core, that healthcare is a human right. And right now, millions of people in our state, and certainly many, many more across the country, are not being given access to what I and many others believe is a human right. If you look around the world, so many different countries have a single payer style system. And that's such a big headache that's lifted off of people in terms of financial burden. When you talk about unhoused communities, so many are there because they had a medical emergency or a family member had a medical emergency and they couldn't keep up with the bills. It's unconscionable. It's absolutely unconscionable. My father gets Medicare, but that doesn't include dental. He actually ended up in the hospital because he had an infection because he went so long to go to the doctor. I didn't even know he didn't tell me that he had gone so long without going to the dentist. He finally had a teeth extraction and it caused an infection because he'd waited so long. This is not normal. It shouldn't be normal. We should, and not only that, in my bill, long-term care will be covered as well. Long-term care bankrupts so many families. Right? It is so expensive, and we are not treating, those with disabilities or seniors with dignity at all. And we have a system that's completely unsustainable. It's the most expensive in the world. Does not have the best outcomes by far. There's millions that start GoFundMe accounts. There's millions that go bankrupt. Tens of thousands that die every year because they don't have access to healthcare. So, I do have an urgency when it comes to us actually fixing this problem. It's going to be a massive battle because, look, our current system, the estimates are that a single payer system in California would cost around $400 billion. Our current system costs $450 billion and leaves millions without adequate access to healthcare. So obviously there's a whole lot of profit being made off of us and off the people. So they're not going to let go of that so easily. But, you know, I will argue with anyone as to the merits of having a system where you get to choose your own provider, but at the very least, you don't have healthcare, the cost overburdening you. Or I don't know how many times it's happened where your doctor recommends something and then you have to actually squabble with or fight with your insurance to cover it. How does that make any kind of sense? No, you tell I'm passionate about this. The last thing I'll say is employer-based healthcare makes no sense. Other countries look at us and it's nonsensical. And I will tell you, single payer will be great for employers too, because how many employers have to bargain with these insurance companies and these healthcare providers every year with very little leverage? Every year they offer less and less to their employees, higher co-pays, higher premiums. And I mean, even under Obamacare, under the Affordable Care Act, the poorest people can only afford the bronze plan. That's a $6,000 deductible. Not to mention co-pays. That's not affordable. And so it's like, you know, saying that's access to healthcare for our poorest Californians is like me having, you know, a business card for a Lamborghini salesman. Great. I have access to a Lamborghini. Am I going to call them? No, because my bank account tells me, you know what? I can't afford that. And so access and actually having healthcare are two different things. And it's AB 1400 is the bill. You know, I think that we need to lead as a state in this nation. You know, in Canada, one state led it. Saskatchewan was the first state, and then it became other states followed. And so they do have a state model that the national government supports. That's something I think that we need to move forward on. Now that Trump's not in office, I think when Trump was there, he was attacking the Affordable Care Act. It was understandable. We needed to focus on preserving the Affordable Care Act, which did provide access for a lot of Californians. Now that we have Democrats in office, there's an opportunity for us to again start this fight for healthcare for all.
We have a follow-up question on healthcare, and just to make everyone aware, the league does support having the public option for healthcare.
Yeah.
But again, and this is a comment that we struggle to support legislation without funding mechanism in the legislation. And could you talk about that?
Well, I think that there's a couple ways to look at it. And one is that there's two things that have to be done, a design of a system and the funding. Now, I think that we should work on both at the same time on a parallel track. And this is why. Not having a system and not showing that there's a political will and interest in California to have a single payer system, what that does, it prevents us from answering so many questions on the funding. For example, we have to go to the federal government for a waiver because about $200 billion of our healthcare is paid for in state and federal funds. So a federal waiver is critical, but a federal waiver without any sense of what a system will look like doesn't answer the questions that would be required in order to get a federal waiver. And that also goes to employers. How am I going to go to employers and say, hey, you know, I want you, instead of paying into these funds and all that, I want you to come over and put your money into a public single payer fund. Well, you know, for them to do that, they have to know what they're paying into, right? And so there are so many question marks as to the funding that it's going to require a huge amount of work with the governor's office, with employers, with you know, legislators and the federal government. So we're talking about a waiver. We're talking about the GAN limit, which is the limit on how much we can spend every year. Prop 98 funds. There's so many question marks that if we wait until all those question marks on funding are answered, we're never going to be able to design a system. And I think that we need to do both. Design a system, which in turn will help us answer some of those questions as the funding. Because we know that the money is there, but it's not as simple as saying, okay, we have $450 billion in our system now. Let's just move that over to single payer. I get it's naive to say it's that simple. And so to expect one bill to be able to answer both the design and the funding is also unrealistic. And I think by designing a system that we can be proud of, we not only are being aspirational, we're actually saying these are the nuts and bolts of the system. If you read 1400, it goes into detail on what a system will look like and how it would actually save money and have cost controls as well. So it's a perfectly reasonable question as to funding mechanism, but that's the reason why I believe we need to design a system. And I support, for example, calling on the governor to ask for a federal waiver. Absolutely. We should be working on that. Absolutely. We should be having conversations on whether we need to go to the ballot, whether it's on gun limit or taxation, what have you. And keep in mind, this is going to be cheaper. As people say, oh, aren't you going to have the tax? Or isn't there going to be a tax? Well, what do you think premiums are? What do you think, like, the premiums that employers pay every day, every year, and workers pay? I mean, you can call it a premium. It's a tax. Like, so that's out of pocket costs are going to go down. But we do have to have many layers of conversation in order to pay for this type of system. And I recognize that.
I do have a question. This actually is coming from Santa Clara County, your part of the world. Would you state the bill number again, just to be sure?
Oh yeah, it's AB 1400.
1400. Okay, I hope everybody got that. And thanks for the questions. We're getting some thank yous for your work on the Racial Justice Act. So send that along, another thank you. And I have a broader question now. It says, do you look at all legislation with the vision of how it will affect minorities and those underserved?
So my whole purpose, and it's a very general purpose in my role as an elected official or as a someone in public service, whether I have a title next to my name or not, is to reduce suffering. And there's no doubt that right now, it's very clear in our nation that there are segments of our community that suffer more than others. There's no doubt that racism and systemic racism and inequality has been part of our nation before we were even formally a nation. So absolutely, I'm always going to look at a lens of how do we bring greater equality? How do we reduce suffering? How do we bring justice to everyone? Because I think ultimately it hurts all of us when there's inequality. Even if you benefit from it, it hurts all of us when there's injustice, even if you benefit from privilege. As a man, I have male privilege. It hurts me that there's inequality and that women suffer with inequality. And if I don't see that, then I think that I don't understand what it is to fight for justice for all. And so absolutely, I have a lens for equality and for justice for everyone in our society. And we all have different levels of privilege and inequality we suffer from in different ways. But I think ultimately, we have to recognize that if there are others suffering more than we are, then it's incumbent upon us not just to recognize it, but to do something about it.
A follow-up to a previous question. We have someone asking, isn't a policy bill first, followed by a funding bill? Maybe you can talk about the sequencing and how that works in the state legislature.
Sure. Yeah, so it is a policy bill, and which is separate from funding. However, in a typical bill, the policy issue, if it has a cost to it, it goes through appropriations, and there's got to be some sense of how things are going to be paid for. Now, this is not a typical bill. This is not like a bill where we're going to increase Medi-Cal reimbursements and we need to find, $10 million, $20 million to do it. This is not, we're going to build a clinic in East Los Angeles and we need $6 million of general fund budget to pay for it. This is a restructuring of how we pay for our healthcare system. And that's why I see it a little bit differently. And that's why I absolutely believe that we can't wait on a design of the system simply because the questions on funding are really hard. And they are. And they're very difficult. But the reason why they're difficult is because there are stakeholders that are profiting wildly off our current system that are going to make it difficult. And if you look, I would encourage anyone, especially on Twitter, to follow Wendell Potter. He's a former VP of Cigna, and he left the insurance industry as a whistleblower, and he will tell you how much the insurance industry works to really put deception out there. One of his jobs when he was with Cigna was to spread misinformation about the Canadian system to Americans. And so the reality is that I'm down to meet with and talk with anyone that's meaningfully interested in a healthcare system that is equitable, fair, and cost efficient, and provides healthcare for every single person in California. If folks are just going to be interested in spreading deception and misconception, I'm not so interested in that, and I'm willing to call it out. And so I think the funding piece is going to have a lot of deception and misconception, including folks say, well, I like my insurance. Well, the reality is that I don't know how many people like staying online with their insurance company for an hour. The reality is typically they like their doctor, they like their nurses, they like the people that provide their care. And those that provide the care are not going to change under a single payer system. It's not government run healthcare. It is the fact that we pull together the resources of 40 million people, and we leverage that to reduce pharmaceutical costs. We leverage that to ensure that we're having the most cost efficient. I want the money to go to the doctors and the nurses and the janitors in the hospital and the physician assistants and the techs and those in the cafeteria when you're in the hospital cooking your food. I want the money to go there. And so it's not a situation where people have to consider it as you're losing out on something. Our system right now is one that is the most expensive, and we're losing out right now in an extraordinarily expensive system where a lot of our neighbors have next to nothing or zero access to healthcare. And that is not a humane society.
We have a question that it's sort of general in nature, and I'll take advantage of the fact that you were council member in San Jose. It's just about effective advocacy. And they're also talking, they were referring to actually the funding, the public funding bill, the public bank bill, and how to advocate at a local level. You mentioned San Jose, but maybe you might want to give a few tips before we close.
Yeah, absolutely. So there is a statewide public banking organization group. There's also one locally here, and you can connect with folks like, some folks may know Jake Tonkel, who ran for city council. He's a great local advocate for public banks, but we can certainly get you information on how to connect locally with our local San Jose chapter for public banks. And like I said, I'm looking to hopefully do something locally to promote our statewide bill, and would love to, we'll certainly get that information to the league to make sure that all of you could take part in it and to be part of this statewide network, as well as our regional hubs of that statewide network.
Well, we just want to thank you so much, Assemblymember, for taking time out. We know it's a hectic time in Sacramento right now with the legislature cranking into high gear here. And we want to thank you so very much. And again, we will move on to the next part of the program. And we're so grateful for your time.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Oh, yeah. Bye-bye.
Bye.
And we'll turn it over now to President Sherry Smith again.
Hello. I'm trying to get myself here. Speaker view, no. I took it off mute and I stopped. I put it on video, but I'm not here, I don't think. Am I here? Are you hearing me?
You're
You
here.
are there. You
are
Am
here.
I just don't see myself.
We see you.
Do you? Oh, good. I'm seeing you sort of, Madeline. Excuse me, us for this crosstalk here, but good afternoon. Thanks so much, Assemblymember Kalra, for this truly wonderful presentation and for answering the questions of all these inquiring minds. Our concluding speaker, Stephanie Doute, is the executive director of the League of Women Voters of California. Still a relative newbie, Stephanie has been with the California League for just over a year. And in her first year, she has stewarded the organization through not only COVID, but social uprising and the most contentious election cycle and threat to democracy of our lifetimes. I think we'll all acknowledge that. Stephanie has a background in nonprofit management, community engagement, and activism, and she has a personal passion for equity and justice. In her non-work time, she has spent many years volunteering and leading in community and police activism for LGBTQIA+ rights before joining the League. Now she gets to spend her days working with the League on issues of equity and justice for all people. Stephanie, are you? I do see you. I'm glad to see you. It's all yours.
All right, I'm here. Thank you so much for that introduction, Sherry. And before I get started, just a huge thank you to you and the team who put this day together. I feel like I need to take a breath and just let it all sit and absorb it all. This has been an amazing morning, and we've heard from some amazing speakers. So thank you for pulling this together for all of us. Let's see, do we have some slides here? I'll just get started while we pull up those slides. So as we wrap up our time together today, I want to bring us back a little bit to where we started to kind of bring it full circle and then talk a little bit about what this work looks like or could look like from a League perspective. I saw someone with a question in the chat earlier asking about, okay, but what do we do at our local League? So I think we're going to touch on that a little bit. When we started today, we visualized equality, equity, and inclusion with the images of the people watching the baseball game. So I've chosen to bring us back around to that visualization with a slightly different image. And this one includes justice, because seeking justice is at the heart of equity. And I really wanted us to take a minute to make sure that as we're going through this, we incorporate justice into our thinking and our perspective. When we're working on equity and with equity, we're moving and distributing the boxes so that in the face of a systemic problem, we seek to ensure that people have access to the tools it takes to overcome the system. The boxes are the resources. And when we distribute them with equity, everyone can peek over this fence and enjoy the sunset. Everyone has a place to live. Everyone has access to clean water. Everyone has the same experience in the criminal legal system. And when we shift to a justice mindset alongside that, we also have to figure out how to dismantle the systems that cause the inequity to begin with, so that we don't run out of boxes, or so that someone else doesn't come along and grab the boxes and carry them away, because resources to create equity are never guaranteed. So we simultaneously work towards taking down the fence so that we fix the systemic problem. That way, the people who are, it's not just fixed for the people who are there now and have boxes, but for all of those who will come in the future. Once that fence is down, anyone who wants to see the sunset has a clear view. And I think it's important for us in League to keep this dual perspective in mind as we embark on all of our work, whether it be policy, advocacy, implementation, voter education and engagement, or the way we run and manage our leagues. Equity and justice are key elements in building a healthy, thriving future for all people and for our League. All right, next slide, please. So you get it. We've had a lot of conversations about this today, and it's clear. So what do we actually do in League? How do we apply these concepts in work? So I want to talk about that a bit, and I want to approach it from sort of three buckets: advocacy and policy, voter education, engagement, and League management. So what we're going to do is take a look at some frameworks in each area that will kind of give us a guideline for things we might do. Next, please. Let's see. So if we start with advocacy, so you want to apply an equity and justice perspective to your League work, but where do you start? If you're in advocacy, first you want to understand the League position on the issue. No matter what issue you're working on, climate change, healthcare, housing, homelessness, education, water, criminal legal system reform, we've heard about so much of those things today. And so many of the embedded equity issues in there. There are equity and justice issues that run deep into them. So start by understanding the League position, because that's going to give us the foundation for knowing what to do. Next, we want to explore things with an equity lens, and we've heard that a lot. Next slide, please. So what does it mean when we explore something through an equity lens in a really practical way? An equity lens is a process for analyzing or diagnosing the impact of the policies on under-resourced and diverse individuals and groups, and then to identify and potentially reduce or eliminate those barriers. So now we're working to eliminate and reduce barriers. How do we do that? What's next? Next slide, please. So here's a series of questions to ask yourself. And I'm sorry, my slides didn't line up exactly right here for you. This is a series of questions that's going to give you a framework for your equity lens. Oh, if you could go back one for me. There we go. Nope, one more. Here we are. So who does the policy impact? What are the forces driving this policy? Are there individuals or communities that will be disproportionately and negatively affected by the policy? Does it perpetuate or does it help dismantle historical, legal, or other barriers set in the past? And if disparities are identified, how can they be mitigated or eliminated? So as you're going through your process, this is a great sort of screening framework to look at policy implementation, and ensure that you're taking an equity lens to it so that you're exploring all of these issues. Next slide, please. So coming back to this idea of in advocacy, what could this look like all around? So you understand the league position. We've just talked through the equity lens and the equity lens assessment question. So then take those answers that you came to through your equity lens assessment. Who are the community partners you should be working with based on the answers you came up with in your equity lens assessment? Reach out to those groups, participate with them. I think sometimes we want people to participate with us, but I think it's really important for us to understand that we also need to participate with them, our community partners in their spaces. And that sort of mutual engagement is really, really valuable. And I think it's really important that we stop and listen. And when we're deciding what we want to do and how we want to approach something, we center the voices and the experiences of people who are impacted directly by whatever we're talking about. And we have identified those folks through our equity lens assessment. We've reached out to community partners. And so now we want to use our space and our power to center the voices and experiences of those people. And then work alongside your community partners to advocate or implement with this equity and justice mindset. So it's a framework because every issue is different. Every issue has different things embedded in it. But if we follow a framework like this, it allows us to apply an equity lens every step of the way. All right, next slide, please. So the next bucket that I want to sort of approach is voter education and engagement, because that's a big part of what we do. And equity is not just something we want to think about with policy. We want to think about equity with voter education engagement as well. So the heart of voter education is communication. We don't do it just to transfer knowledge. We attempt to transfer knowledge so voters feel like they understand the issues, that they increase their confidence in the understanding of the issues and the voting process, and that knowledge is sufficient to break down hesitancy about voting. Our end goal, right, is a voter who has the confidence in their own vote and casts a ballot. They use their voice. So with that end goal in mind, and we start to apply an equity lens to our voter education work, what might that look like? So next slide, please. All right, so again, we're going to revisit the idea of equality versus equity. When we take an equity approach to community education, we start by looking at the barriers to learning, access to information. And while this slide sourced from Lexia Learning talks about individual learners, we might look at different groups in our communities or different community members, because what we want to do is create education that doesn't insist that we're all starting from the same place with how much we know or how we learn or our access to information. The equity framework wants us to ask what barriers exist for learners and then focus on identifying and developing the solutions that will support those individuals or communities. So how do we do that? Can you go 2 slides for me? Because I got these a little out of order when I sent them to you. So start by asking yourself equity lens questions before you decide what kind of voter education efforts you'll undertake. At League, we have a series and we have a bucket of work that we typically do with every election. Candidate forums and pros and cons and all of those things. And we come to election cycle and we're off and running because we know our timelines are tight. And we know that, you know, people in our communities are counting on us to deliver those. But what if we took a pause? What if we took a pause at the beginning of that and asked ourselves some equity lens questions? All right, can you go backwards a slide for me now? Thank you. So from a voter education perspective, are there historical, social, economic, or other barriers that exist in our community that cause disparities in access to civic education? How can our voter education work contribute to mitigating or eliminating these disparities? Then it's what do we need to create to reach these historically under-resourced members in our community? And finally, a question that's actually kind of difficult, I think, for us to work with sometimes. Are we the right organization to be delivering the education? Are we, the League, the trusted messengers with the groups that we've identified? Or would working with a partner increase access? And that is sometimes a difficult thing for us to tap into because we work really, really hard. But I think sometimes considering whether a community partner is a better delivery, is a better, more trusted community partner to deliver information that we develop is an important screener for us to think about. All right, next slide, please. Oh, I think we need to go back one. There we go. So after you've done your equity lens questions, now you're deciding what kind of things you want to produce, how you want to reach out to your community. Engage a diverse group of creators in producing your voter education efforts, particularly engaging with the people and partners that you identified in your assessment. Attempt to meet people where they are. If you build it, they will come. Does not work with community education. We have to meet people where they are. We have to deliver information in the ways that people can consume it and internalize it and be empowered by it or feel like it has made a difference to them. Again, keeping in mind, our end goal here is a voter who is confident, cast a ballot, and use their voice. Then there are things that we talk about a lot in League, and I think we do pay a lot of attention to, and I just wanted to flag those here: language access, cultural relevance, using plain language, and ensuring what we produce is accessible for people with disabilities, and then addressing representation in the materials we present. Maybe it's videos or documents or flyers or PDFs or websites, social media, whatever those things look like, representation matters. So as you go through this framework, if you approach your voter education with this sort of equity framework in mind, you might find that there are important ways you want to change the way you do candidate forums or pros and cons presentations. You might decide not to do any of those. You might decide we are actually spot on with what we should be doing here and we're going to keep going. But this framework, going through a framework like this, allows you to be intentional and allows you to approach all of the things you do with voter education from that sort of equity mindset. And then we're going to, next slide, please. Now we're going to transition into League management. So we're going to talk about, this is the question I saw in the chat was, how do we diversify our League? How do we bring in and get involved more people who aren't like us? That's really the heart of the question I saw. So I think about this through a framework of 3 A's: acknowledge, assess, and act. And we have done a very good job today and in many other places, acknowledging our history and exploring the impacts of that history. But I think it's also important to acknowledge that we still live in a society built on systemic racism. We've been talking about the impacts of that all day today. And our leagues, in the way we function, in the way we operate, in the space we hold, we're not immune to that. So how can we look at the way our leagues work to tear down the vestiges of those things that remain? And I just want to reiterate something that we heard this morning, that honesty and vulnerability in these conversations are okay and they're required. It's in those spaces of discomfort that we grow the most, that we make the most progress. And so we have an opportunity to learn from our discomfort and to sit in our discomfort and be better for it. So that's where we sit with acknowledge. And then we can come to assess. Assess the historical structural barriers to full participation and engagement with our leagues. Listen to our members, our past members, and community partners to inform the assessment. So what practices do we have that might create barriers? Just think about the images we looked at when I started talking. We're looking for our fences, right? We're not necessarily looking here for where we need to put more boxes. We're looking for our fences. Where are the fences in our league? The structural pieces. Have we listened? Do we understand the experiences people from diverse backgrounds have or have had with our league? Do we really take those to heart? How can we dismantle those barriers or tear down those fences to create a more inclusive league? I mean, at the heart of this is listening and understanding and assessing, and then we're going to move to act. So act on what you learned. Create an equity plan that's doable for you and your league. Be specific in your intent and the measurable goals you set out to achieve. So what does that look like? What might that look like? You've identified your barriers or your fences. So this is a long piece of work. This is not something we're going to start and be done with in 6 months. This is ongoing, and we won't be able to address everything we identify all at once. So prioritize. Create a plan about which of the barriers you're going to address, in what order, and what are some of the goals that you want to associate with those. Things you might do. Ensure ongoing training for your board members. Do you all understand inclusive social justice people first language and use that with each other in your education, in your community outreach, with your partners? Do you have ongoing training about microaggressions and understand how those are at play, how they impact your members and community partners, and how to eliminate them? What are the issues raised when you were listening to your members and your community partners? That's where you get your plan. So you can develop a plan to acknowledge those and address them head on. Again, creating measurable goals, because what we measure is what gets done. I think that's one of those things we hold true in business and in nonprofits and in life. Set the intent to diversify both your board and your membership simultaneously and make a plan. And we can't come together as one large group and make a plan for how to do that, because your assessment at each league is going to inform your plan. And so this is the framework to give you the information to make a plan that works for your league. Things you might look at. What barriers to entry did you identify in your process? Are people able to easily understand what you're doing and engage with your league? Are there small volunteer opportunities that open doors for people with different capacities to participate? Do we welcome new people who might not know as much as we do and engage them in a supporting learning environment? Or do we expect people to be where we are, and if they're not, we move on? Do we mentor? Do we have new member onboarding and robust welcomes? Do we have a way for new people to know what volunteer opportunities are available and raise their hand and step up? Or do we invite people we know to take on volunteer work? Do we see the same faces in the same roles year after year, or the same faces in multiple roles year after year? Do we embrace new ideas, or do we do what we've always done because that's what we do and it's been very successful in many instances? If you answer these kinds of questions or others like them, you will start to see your diversity and equity plan come to life, because there's no one size fits all solution. So we can't sit together and talk about the one size fits all plan for how to do this. But if we take this appreciative inquiry approach And then I don't know if you can see behind me, but I have this sign on my wall that says stay curious, because that's my approach to everything. I firmly believe in it. If you take this appreciative inquiry approach, you will start to see the fences. You will start to see the places where your plan should be, and it will come to life. And I think that we're all working on that. This takes us that way. And someone said, and it gives you a way to iterate too. So we did this worked, this didn't, we hit these goals, we didn't hit these goals. Here are some more things we learned. Let's iterate for the next year or 2 years or whatever time frame you put it on. And I think at the end of the day, doing this, you can go ahead and go to the next slide, please. We really believe and want League to be for everyone, because the work we do is for everyone. And we want to create leagues where everyone can follow their passion to make a better world. And I think that is sort of a framework that we can use as an organization to address equity in our large, in the larger areas of work that we do. So I'm gonna stop here and open the floor for questions.
This is Roma, and I guess, Sherry, did you want to moderate this, or should I go ahead?
You can go ahead, because I'm not quite sure where to go get the questions.
I am in chat and I don't see any, probably because folks didn't realize. If you, we have a few minutes to let Stephanie take questions, but I'm asking you to enter them into chat right now. I actually, well, maybe this is it. We have one that says, how can we gather and share information on model programs that have delivered on the equity lens? Maybe that's a good place to start, Stephanie.
That's a great question. One of the things that we're working on with the DE&I task force at the state level right now is creating a space for league members and league leaders online to be able to talk about and share resources, to share model programs, share reading resources, talk about what's working well for you, ask questions, and really create a safe sharing space so that we can all reach each other easily to ask these questions. And I expect that you will hear more about that as we roll into convention. And there may be some information coming out about that at convention, but the DE&I task force has been working very hard to create that kind of space, because I think there's a recognition that it's needed.
I think at this point we are at the 12:30 stop point, and so we would love to be able to continue on, but this was our commitment to try to wrap up at 12:30. Stephanie, we are so pleased that you are part of not only the league but of this event as well. You've helped to point us to where we want to go from here and how we do that. And so thanks so much, Stephanie, for spending this time with us. And now we take what we've learned here and we enhance the league's commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Remember, this entire morning and into afternoon has been recorded. You can hear it again if you wish, and you can share it with your league members. We'll send all registrants a link for that. Thanks to you all for being with us today. Our next Bay Area League event will be held on Saturday, May the 1st. It's our biennial council, which is like a mini convention. We'll be sending you all more information on this within the next couple of weeks. Until we meet again, take good care. And now, as a special treat, we will conclude with a video of the inspirational presentation at President Biden's inauguration by Amanda Gorman former National Youth Poet Laureate. And here she is.
Mr. President, Dr. Biden, Madam Vice President, Mr. Emhoff, Americans, and the world. When day comes, we ask ourselves, where can we find light in this never-ending shade? The loss we carry, a sea we must wade. We've braved the belly of the beast. We've learned that quiet isn't always peace, and the norms and notions of what just isn't always just is. And yet the dawn is ours before we knew it. Somehow we do it. Somehow we've weathered and witnessed a nation that isn't broken, but simply unfinished. We, the successors of a country and a time where a skinny Black girl descended from slaves and raised by a single mother can dream of becoming president, only to find herself reciting for one. And yes, we are far from polished, far from pristine, but that doesn't mean we are striving to form a union that is perfect. We are striving to forge our union with purpose, to compose a country committed to all cultures, colors, characters, and conditions of man. And so we lift our gazes not to what stands between us, but what stands before us. We close the divide because we know to put our future first, we must first put our differences aside. We lay down our arms so we can reach out our arms to one another. We seek harm to none and harmony for all. Let the globe, if nothing else, say this is true. That even as we grieved, we grew, that even as we hurt, we hoped, that even as we tired, we tried, that we'll forever be tied together, victorious, not because we will never again know defeat, but because we will never again sow division. Scripture tells us to envision that everyone shall sit under their own vine and fig tree, and no one shall make them afraid. If we're to live up to our own time, then victory won't lie in the blade, but in all the bridges we've made. That is the promised glade, the hill we climb, if only we dare it, because being American is more than a pride we inherit. It's the past we step into and how we repair it. We've seen a force that would shatter our nation rather than share it, would destroy our country if it meant delaying democracy. And this effort very nearly succeeded. But while democracy can be periodically delayed, it can never be permanently defeated. In this truth, in this faith we trust, for while we have our eyes on the future, history has its eyes on us. This is the era of just redemption. We feared it at its inception. We did not feel prepared to be the heirs of such a terrifying hour, but within it we found the power to author a new chapter, to offer hope and laughter to ourselves. So, while once we asked, how could we possibly prevail over catastrophe? Now we assert, how could catastrophe possibly prevail over us? We will not march back to what was, but move to what shall be, a country that is bruised but whole, benevolent but bold, fierce and free. We will not be turned around or interrupted by intimidation, because we know our inaction and inertia will be the inheritance of the next generation. Our blunders become their burdens, but one thing is certain. If we merge mercy with might and might with right, then love becomes our legacy and change our children's birthright. So let us leave behind a country better than the one we were left. With every breath from my bronze pounded chest, we will raise this wounded world into a wondrous one. We will rise from the gold-limbed hills of the West. We will rise from the windswept Northeast, where our forefathers first realized revolution. We will rise from the lake-rimmed cities of the Midwestern states. We will rise from the sun-baked South. We will rebuild, reconcile, and recover in every known nook of our nation, in every corner called our country. Our people, diverse and beautiful, will emerge battered and beautiful. When day comes, we step out of the shade, aflame and unafraid. The new dawn blooms as we free it. For there is always light, if only we're brave enough to see it, if only we're brave enough to be it.